Okay, well, welcome everyone. Um, the way we're set up here, if we were together, we'd probably do two welcomes. Maybe what we can do before we put the slides up is go to gallery view and have everybody turn on your camera. It looks like a lot of people have already. And we'll get a chance to look at each other before we get into the slides. I'll see if there's anybody that I'm not familiar with. I might ask you to introduce yourselves. Austin, you're unfamiliar to me. Would you mind introducing yourself to our group?
Yeah, hi. My name is Austin Batson, and I am working with Brittany Cummins, who was a former member of the board and is currently in the governor's office. I'm a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy, here working for the summer, with Brittany working on a couple projects, and this is one of the meetings that she invited me to. Before this, I taught high school physics in Texas, and I'm focusing on education policy for my master's degree. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. And feel free to jump into question and answer. As we have dialogue, feel free to jump in the chat or by unmuting yourself. Our group's small enough that we can usually manage dialogue by just communicating a little more traditionally.
Okay. Perfect. Well, glad to be here.
All right. Before we get started, is there any members of our AAPAC group that have any questions generally before we start our meeting today? All right. Let me see if I can get the right screen shared. And we'll put it into slideshow. View. Okay. All right. Hopefully you had a chance to look at our agenda that was sent out. I guess it's been about a week ago as we try to finalize this. The slides that we'll go through today, they're available through the recording, and I certainly can send them out at the conclusion of the meeting as well. We hope to be able to get through our content and finish up by noon today. We usually do a good job of being able to stay on track with our timing. I wanted to start off with these three topics for our agenda. We'll review the AAPAC recommendations from our February meeting. It seems like a long time ago that we met. The legislative session has come to a conclusion since that time. We've had a couple of different TAC meetings. One of the benefits of holding our meetings virtual, especially with our TAC committee, because they come from all over the country, is we've been able to hold short TAC meetings and strategically place those into parts of the calendar where they seem to fit best, rather than have to rely on those being back-to-back full day or day and a half meetings. So we'll review some recommendations that our TAC committee made during an April meeting. And then I'll provide an update to this group on the standards assessment, also known as our RISE, our grades 3 through 8, language arts, math, and science assessment. The RFP for that has come to a conclusion, at least the scoring committee. The board still, and the contract work and board approval of the contract is still to come, but a vendor was selected and notifications went out on Thursday of this week. So the timing of our meeting in regards to that is really pretty good. So if we go back in time to February, there were a couple of specific recommendations that came out of our group. The first one there, we talked about addressing concerns that our education community had about moving forward with assessment, statewide assessment at the time. AAPAC recommended we provide some communication tools. There's three specific ones. There were other things that were done, but we provided a written document called Why Assess, an email from the superintendent Dixon to all teachers, and then an assessment FAQ that was sent out throughout the spring, at least at the State Board of Education's office, the Assessment Accountability Office. We see very few concerns related to our efforts to move forward with assessing our students during the spring of 21. I think that's a tribute to the great work that our LEA's leadership teams did in communicating the reason for that, and then also the fact that accountability was not going to be used for that. There was also discussion around really taking a close look at our assessment results and determining whether we can use those going forward. And we'll talk more about this today specifically, but we've instituted and found funding to conduct a study on exploring the effects of the pandemic on student achievement. And again, we'll get into that in more detail as we move forward. When we met in February, the legislative session was underway, but not much had concluded in relationship to assessment and accountability. So I'll have a couple of slides here where we'll talk about or review some of the most significant pieces of the legislation, state legislation that came out of the session related to assessment and accountability. The first two that you see on the screen weren't necessarily new this year. They were pieces of legislation that had been passed the previous session, but with the onset of the pandemic, funding for those programs had been put on hold or removed. And during this legislative session, that funding was restored. And so we've been moving forward with identification, preparation, and delivery this fall of the mathematics benchmark assessment, and then expanding the benchmark assessments for reading to grades 1 through 6 in elementary settings. The one that I bolded here is more specific to the work that we do in advising the board, the work that this committee does in advising the board about assessment accountability decisions. And that was, there was a movement in this House Bill 2, removes the requirement for USP to designate low performing schools. Those are also known as our turnaround schools, not just in 2020, 2021, but also in 21, 22. So we have a couple of years now where we will not be designating schools for turnaround. And we can talk more about the alternative uses of those funds, but that's pretty significant, especially for those schools that might have been identified. Those resources associated with that program then will not go out the way they have in the past. Before I move to the next slide, is there anyone that has questions or comments on these three pieces of these three effects of legislation?
Yeah, Darren, maybe a real quick question. What about those schools that were in turnaround? Are they just put on pause until the 22-23 year, or are they taken off? Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so this House Bill 2 was specific to the requirement to identify or designate low performing schools. It does not affect, this piece of legislation does not affect the efforts of the schools that have been previously identified in cohort 1, 2, or 3, and their ability to exit. What does interrupt or affect those schools is the suspension of assessment in 2020, and then concerns about the validity of the data that we have this year. But the review of schools for exit continues to move forward. Board Member Cannon, I think I saw your hand come up earlier.
Yeah, that was basically my question as well. I was just kind of concerned about those who are in turnaround now, if this would have any effect upon them. And Darren, is there any limit to how long a school can remain in turnaround without being able to exit?
Yeah, there are within the rule, there are timelines that are in there. And I see Michelle Neal's hand is up. I wonder if she could also, you might have a question, Michelle, or you might have something to contribute. So I'm going to ask you to help respond to that.
Okay, so those schools who were, what I was going to add was that those schools who were on timeline to exit this year, we are conducting another review panel similar to those schools that exited last year, based on the review panel where they bring additional formative or qualitative or quantitative data to the review panel for the panel to make a recommendation to exit. So we are repeating that process for this cohort that is scheduled to exit this year at the end of the month. To Janet's question, schools can receive, I believe, up to a 2-year extension, and then they may move into more intensive consequences, which there are many of them outlined in the turnaround rule.
And Michelle, I'm just thinking, we've had one school that was in cohort 1 and has never exited. Is there a point in time when something else it happens besides just remaining in turnaround?
To my knowledge, at this point, all schools that were in cohort 1 have now been able to exit. But I am happy to look into that further. I could be mistaken. And
Yeah, we just heard from one in our last meeting, and took note that they had been in cohort 1, and none of the others had been in that long. So that's the reason for my concern.
Thank you. I believe we have been able to exit all cohort 1 schools. To my knowledge, there are not any remaining, but like I said, I could be wrong. But we are trying to continue with that review panel process for the upcoming exiting cohort.
Okay. Well, would you just double check on that and let me know? It's a school in Granite District. And we've heard, we keep hearing from them every time we have turnaround. So.
Yeah, and then board member Cannon, the other question that I heard more general than just that specific school is within the rule. It sounds like you're interested in understanding what the timelines are and what consequences there are that would force a school to either improve, or if they don't at some point, what then happens. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we had some additional in Senate Bill 184, a third substitute. We have some additional actions that affected assessment and accountability. This is the bill where the state legislature gave us some relief from using state assessment for state level accountability. You'll see a few things there. I bolded that they relieved the board of the requirement to publish a school report card. The asterisk there represents the fact to remind me to mention to this group that the federal government, or the U.S. Department of Education, maintains some reporting requirements around the school report card. But there's additional flexibilities this year that are provided in how a state, an SEA, publishes information that they receive through the assessment cycle that we've just completed or close to completing in some states. This was important for us to consider, because we'll have further conversation later today about best practices, and we'll be seeking guidance from this group about what steps we should take, or the board should take, in regards to publishing our data that we received. We have a couple of platforms that we typically use, the school report card platform and also the data.
Darren, I don't know if you could see the hands up. Board member Earl has her hand up.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Scott. Board member Earl.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you midway there. If I understand right, this still allows us to analyze the data and the results in a way that we know where our successes were, because that's key, versus actually using them for accountability methods. Is that accurate in saying?
That's a perfect lead into the next discussion, because Darren.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Board member Earl, you're correct. At the state level, the state legislature gave the board a broad range to decide how and when and in what format to share with the public information related to statewide assessment and accountability. The federal level, they require the SEA, the state, to publish certain piece of information, but they allow flexibility to the style, the format, and the manner in which the state board will publish that information. So you're correct, and we'll get into that, as Scott mentioned, in better detail, and we'll actually seek recommendations from this committee regarding that.
Okay, sorry if I'm getting a little ahead. I just wanted to make sure I understood it in my mind, what we were working with. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You'll see there's some other things that were included in Senate Bill 184, third substitution. Before I switch from this slide, are there other questions or comments around this information?
Darren, this is Janet. I can't get to raise my hand, but one more. I'm thinking about all of these. we won't be doing ratings of schools. We won't be publishing a school report card. How does that work in terms of longevity? Does that just mean that the longevity data that we have had on schools will abruptly be ended and we'll have to start over again? Or how does that work with your systems?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, it's a concern about the longitudinal comparability of data that prior to 2020, the state board had a good, well, actually since 2014, using the same language arts and math standards and a similar, even though the report card changed, we continued to publish the same type of data. So we had this longitudinal trend line that we could look at, and with the suspension of assessment in 20 and then the unknowns about the data that we're collecting in 21, it sounds like your question's related to what does that mean for our longitudinal data? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's there's certainly an interruption to it. Scott, I don't know if you want to jump in with some thoughts.
Yeah, just the good thing about it is that it's an empirical question, right? It's we will have data to evaluate this, and you know whether this is going to be like an asterisk in the record books, or I don't think it's going to be a complete restart, given the proportion of kids who tested this year in Utah. It will mark a point. We'll show you some preliminary results soon, that kids didn't do as well this year as they did in previous years, but that's to be expected. And so is that a break in trend, or is this capturing the pandemic effect well? So I think that we'll be able to tell whether or not the scales hold, and we'll be doing those analysis. And I'm actually, again, given the proportion of kids who tested and the amount of time kids spent in school in Utah, especially compared to other states, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to use the data, not for accountability, but to monitor long-term trends.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll move into a different subject now. As I change this slide, we're going to get into this RFP that is in the final stages. So I had planned on the slides just the check marks to just check of where we were at. But again, the process for selecting or for the scoring committee to recommend a solution concluded earlier this week. And on Thursday, the vendors who submitted proposals were notified of that decision, and I can announce to this group that Cambium, who is the current provider for our RISE assessment, was selected as the best solution by the scoring committee for a long-term contract. There's some parts of that bring some peace to my mind as someone who's got a responsibility for overseeing statewide assessment. One of those is the fact that we will not have to transition between vendors, which reduces risk related to problems that can arise. The challenges that we faced as we transitioned from AIR to Questar are pretty well documented. This group, we've talked about those in the past. So now the work around developing a contract to support that work will begin. And if things go well, we'll have that prepared for our board to consider in August, September at the latest. The next slides, though, talk about some elements in that proposal that we asked vendors to submit suggestions or ideas around as some areas we want to talk about. So if you remember, last year we concluded a development of a state strategic assessment plan with the help of the Center for Assessment and a pretty significant group of stakeholders. But in a number of hours, I calculated about 40 hours per participant's time on that group. They came forward with this plan, and the board reviewed it in December board meeting and accepted the recommendations that were included in this plan. A couple of those in relationship to this RFP, you'll see on the screen here, and that was to reduce, overall, there was some interest in looking at ways to reduce the size of the test or the amount of time required to administer the assessments. One way to do that is to reduce or eliminate subscores, which allows you to shrink your blueprint to some degree, or the number of questions within your blueprint per reporting category. The group also had a strong recommendation to have summative assessments include writing. You see that there were a couple of ideas. You could include a common writing prompt, the variety of shorter questions. That was the highest rated in this working group. And then we could include end of year writing prompt along with several writing tests distributed throughout the year. When we distributed the RFP for vendors to submit proposals for, we asked them to consider the recommendations that were made in this strategic assessment plan and include in their proposals ideas or suggestions on how they think the state board could address those. So this is the first area of questions, a question related to that's the RFP and the recommendations from this state assessment strategic plan. So in regards to writing, the proposal set includes adding a full writing prompt at each grade using passages that support both reading and full write prompts. So in the past, and we've had this pendulum in Utah of writing within our grade 3 through 8 assessment to where we've had 2 prompts before, we've gone down to 1 prompt. Most recently, we administer writing only in grades 5 and 8, which is the minimum required by state statute. In their response, again, to address the recommendations of the state strategic assessment plan, they're proposing one way that we could bring writing in is to have this full prompt using passages that support both reading and writing. So what that looks like is students would read a prompt. There would be questions about it from a reading perspective. And then also they would be required to submit a full writing prompt. Board Member Lear, I see your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Darren. I'm having a brain cramp. I thought the board voted, and I'm really pleased we're having a writing prompt. Let me say that to begin with. But I thought there was a board vote a couple of years ago in order to cut down the length of the assessment to get rid of the writing prompt. Am I remembering wrong? Is this a different issue? Are we changing our minds? Help me.
Yeah, you're correct, Board Member Lear. That decision was made, and that's at the point where we, as a state, took writing out of each grade level ELA test and moved it into a separate writing prompt just for grades 5 and 8. This is where it gets a little challenging for staff, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted this group to talk about this and provide a recommendation or guidance that I can take back to the board. And that is that within that state assessment strategic plan that I showed on the previous slides that we've talked about before, it included recommendations to include writing, looking long-term within our state assessment system to include writing, which then the vendors responded to that by providing ideas of how they could do that under the guidance of what was provided in the state assessment strategic plan.
So to make sure I understand, Darren, so what you're doing is you're asking if we should incorporate this into the assessment plan. Is that the point now?
Yes, I'm asking, what we'll be discussing here is the vendors proposed these 2 ways to try to do that, what was recommended in the state strategic assessment plan, which would help inform staff's work as we prepare a contract for the board, a contract that the board hopefully would be able to fully support when it gets to the board's business.
Thanks. Now I'm understanding, and I don't think I'm crazy. So.
Okay. Yeah, you're definitely not. The writing though has it's been a pendulum swing or a little bit of a roller coaster ride in our state over the last 10 years.
More than that, even we called it the circle of life of writing in Utah, I think, when we were at the task force. So
yeah, so I can see there's some chats coming in, but the way my screen's set up, I can't see the chat.
I'll monitor. You're good. Board Member Cannon though has her hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Board Member Cannon.
Yes, as I read these 2, I'm having kind of difficulty distinguishing between them. So could you help me see how A and B are different?
Yeah, so the way that I read their proposal is A with a full writing prompt would be an extended response to writing. So it'd be similar to what our students experienced prior to the board's most recent change, where we pulled writing into grades 5 and 8 only, to where each grade level, 3 through 8, would have a extended response that they would provide in written format to a prompt. B would be they wouldn't have a long response. They would incorporate more writing into the individual prompts that come into the assessment. So let's say there's 40 prompts within an ELA assessment in any particular grade level. We would look to develop questions that would elicit short response answers and allow students to provide written responses to multiple questions in a shorter format, rather than relying on one prompt to try to evaluate the student's writing ability through the test.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
Brittany's got her hand up there.
Yeah, go ahead, Brittany.
Thanks, Darren. Just curious, is there a possibility of incorporating both of A and B? So there's 2 grades that do the full writing prompt, similar to what's going on now, and then you add a smaller writing prompt that's incorporated in the other grades. Is that an option?
Yes, that would be something we could negotiate through the contract development phase of this. So yeah, that would be something that we could do. So let me
psychometric fun with that, but I think we could do that.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
sorry,
this is Sydney Carter, an assessment development coordinator. I think that's an interesting idea. I would wonder how we would have a comparable score from year to year with writing, like Scott said, with psychometrically. That may be difficult. That may be something to look into.
Yeah, I think we could test that out. I wouldn't rule it out, but it's not a slam dunk, but I wouldn't rule it. But yeah, I don't know. Leslie, what do you think? I think it, it's not as straightforward as doing something common all grades, but if there's enough writing in B there, it might be close enough, because it does get incorporated into an overall ELA scale. It's not like a standalone writing scale. So board member Cummings, that's an interesting idea, I think. So
yeah,
lots of hands up, Darren. A lot of people are interested in writing.
Yeah, I figured this would take some time. So Scott, before I call on someone else, just back to this idea. One way to address some of the psychometric challenges might be, and this should be more of a question, I guess, would be to, on the full prompt that would be given theoretically in grades 5 and 8, we would continue to report those scores separately and not build those into the ELA scale score, and include the short writing responses that would also be included in the 5th and 8th, as well as 3rd through 8th, into the ELA scale score. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think that's, so I would say that if we're going to do writing at every grade level of some type, that we would incorporate the full prompt, let's say it's 5th and 8th, into the ELA score. I think that would be our first attempt. We would look at that, right? Again, everything's empirical, but I think that would work, especially if we had enough writing information, and information in quotes in a psychometric sense, at the other grades would I just have a sense that the way in which these correlate with reading, and that reading dominates the score scale anyway, that I think it could probably work. Leslie, don't hesitate to disagree with me. But again, I'd want to see it empirically. I would want to try out for the first year what you just said. If we wanted to do board member Cummings' idea, I would want to use B at all grades and then use A at the 2 grades. But then I think eventually you would drop out B from those 2 grades where you have the full prompt, because it would just be too long of a test. as my sense. But we would at least have that first year to compare the different forms of writing. So this would be a good TAC discussion, Leslie. I think at our next, we have TAC meetings coming up in September. And seems like a hot agenda item. Go ahead, Leslie, you should weigh in now.
No, I don't have anything at it. You're right. I think ultimately it's an empirical decision. And the only thing I would add, oftentimes probably want to bring in some language arts experts to weigh in on this too, because oftentimes this has come back to what's the construct we're now evaluating, we're assessing in ELA. And psychometricians do not want to pretend to be ELA content experts. So that's where whether it's a separate writing and reading construct or what it is, I think we need their input on that as well.
Well, thankfully, one of them raised their hand, so.
Yeah.
Yes, we've got a few hands up. Sarah, I think, was first, and then board member Earl, and then Jennifer. We'll have you go after that. So Sarah, go ahead.
Thanks, Darren. I had two questions. One is there a time difference in implementing A and B? Does it extend the length of the test a different way, or are those similar? And the other question is, for teachers preparing students, is it different preparation to do A versus B? And how would that kind of affect teacher prep?
Yeah, so I'll start with that second question. You know, the important thing to remember here, whether it was certainly the teachers for sure to remember, is that the standards, the ELA standards in all these grades include standards for writing. So we're hopeful. I think the board, I think I can speak on behalf of them, when they removed writing from the assessment, it wasn't a nod to, we don't value the standards that are included in ELA related to writing. So there's an assumption that teachers continue to teach the writing standards, the same level of urgency that they have even when it was being assessed. So when you talk about would it change the way teachers need to teach or prepare their students, in an ideal setting, the answer to that would be no, that it would just be, they continue to teach writing the way that they have, oriented around the standards that the board's adopted. And then this assessment would just measure the student's proficiency in attainment of those standards. The first question about timing, I don't know that I can answer that because the vendor's proposal, we haven't gotten far enough into the weeds to understand what it would do to the time requirement of the assessment. If adding some short construct questions, you know, Scott mentioned earlier that typically the ELA assessment is heavily skewed towards the reading standards anyway. So whether introducing short writing prompts would allow the test to continue to measure the breadth of the core standards, but do it with fewer questions, because now they use a prompt that elicits multiple types of evidence around different standards with one prompt, like we do with science, where we have what we call clusters, where you get a prompt that's measuring multiple elements of the science standards. That I don't know. I don't know, Scott, if you have an opinion, or Leslie, a thought on.
Yeah, I think we could engineer it if there was a goal to keep the test length across, let's say 3 through 8, the same. Then let's say the full writing prompt was only done, like board member Cummings suggested, at 2 grades, and that was 45 minutes or an hour. I think we just engineer the number of smaller writing responses to equal that amount of time. So, and it would probably give us more information, to be honest, but it's different kind of writing, right? So that's I think what Sarah was getting at. So we want teachers, we want kids to know how to do short writing, long writing, you know, informational writing, argumentative writing, narrative. So that'd be, you know, there's advantages to mixing these up, as board member Cummings suggested, because we might be able to get more genres thrown in there over the course of the kids' span. But man, everybody's interested in this. So yeah. This is good. This is what we want. This is exactly why we have these meetings. So.
Board member Earl.
Yeah, thank you. I have just a couple questions, and one of them is related to when we're talking writing, and maybe those of you that are in the assessment can address this, but we're not talking writing, we're talking typing in a response. So I guess my question is it at what point in younger grades does that actually hamper the ability to communicate in a written format? Do you know what I mean? So the typing skills itself. So that's one concern I have. And then the other issue is we really, this is meant to give a broad understanding of where the kids are. This isn't meant to hit every aspect of writing. That's really what the educators should be doing. And so I think in lessening the writing, we were actually trying to balance out, not give so much weight to the end of the year assessment as much or that pressure to make it so heavily weighted as to what the content of what's taking place within the classroom. So those are just my two comments there.
Okay. And then Jennifer's up next. Maybe Jennifer, in addition to your question, you might be able to address the concern that Board Member Earl expressed around keyboarding versus writing. And, I think we're kind of pointing to our early grades, especially third grade, some limitations that might be in place there. So Jennifer.
Sure, so I'll start with that one. For keyboarding, if you don't type at least 30 words per minute, it does impact your ability to construct information. So a lot of times third grade students will write their ideas first and then type them to kind of avoid that. And in terms of physiologically ready, hands and size of keyboard by third grade are appropriate. Younger than that, their hands are a little small for the typical size keyboard. So age appropriate, yes. Ability to type, no matter what your age is, if you don't type at least 30 words per minute, it does start to have cognitive impact on your ability to communicate. So oftentimes, if I were a third grade teacher, I'd be like, encourage my students, maybe write it out first, and then you can type it, which obviously adds some time demand, but they're short responses, which it sounds like we're leaning towards not having as full of responses in some ways that wouldn't be as difficult to do. So the questions I have, one was, did the RFP realize that we are updating the ELA standards? Like they'll be out in August for draft, that some of the content of the test is going to have to change. Is that?
Yes, Jennifer, that was made clear to them because there's costs associated with, from an assessment perspective. So we needed the vendors to be aware that the ELA standards were going to be changed in some way or form, likely. And so we'll have to go through a series of processes, including rebuilding our item bank, at least addressing item bank deficiencies potentially. So they are aware of that, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just, as we get ready, I don't know how significant things like writing have changed or not. So, and then what the feedback when we had writing before for teachers was they weren't really, through the way that we communicated outcomes, they didn't really know where they could improve. So they'd have kind of a general idea like, okay, my kid scored proficient in writing here, but not more the granular level. I worry with short writing prompts that will continue to not be able to give feedback to educators around how do I improve student writing if I don't have detailed enough to get me at that skill level of what can't my students do. When we have overall proficiency scores, it doesn't give me indications as an educator of what to attend to in my instruction to beef up my students' skill set. So that would be a piece that I'd love to see how we can attend to that and giving more useful feedback to educators if we are going to bring back writing so that they can adjust their practice to better serve their students.
Darren, could I just respond quickly?
Yes, please.
So, Jennifer, that's one thing is just as a point of fact that we noticed from 2014 through like 18, the scores, the increase in scores that we saw on ELA were due more to increasing writing capabilities than reading. There's a writing, so teachers did likely have their kids write more and provide feedback. And as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, the summative test is not the end all and be all. And you guys are still using Utah Compose, right, Darren?
Right.
And that's a great, more formative tool just to get kids writing and get them feedback on a regular basis. And as Board Member Earl said, as teachers be doing just even other writing beyond that. So, but for whatever reason, writing was clearly attended to more, and it did lead to score increases on the ELA test as a result of writing. So that was, people did figure it out, I
I
think.
think you and I know why. You haven't tested before. Once you start testing something,
Pay
practice.
attention. Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
be transparent.
So Darren, I think the order was Frank and then board member Lear. And I don't know if board member Earl has a leftover hand up or a new hand up.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Frank.
Frank, you're muted if you're.
Thank you. And I'll start that too. Thanks. One of the questions that our teachers ask with the writing assessment is they talk about how, well, the impact of the length of the submission that it has on the overall score. And sometimes where, teachers will say, I have these students that have figured out if they just type more, then they get some higher scores, even if the quality might not be what we would like it to be. I haven't looked at any data to see how significant of an error that actually is. I just know that's something that our teachers bring up. My question is, A, is that a significant issue? And B, if it is, does option B of incorporating writing into every testing opportunity through short response writing items alleviate some of that concern?
Okay, and I'm gonna ask Sid if you have an opinion on answering that question, the question about the length. I think you've probably in your time with the board addressed questions and concerns about that in previous years. Sid, are you comfortable responding to that?
Yep.
I could also help if. Go ahead, Sid.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Scott. So first off, the essays are scored on our rubric, and length is not at all a part of the rubric. So if a student is fully responding to prompt within 2 to 3 paragraphs, which is what typically is within the prompt, it kind of directs the students as to how long we're looking at. As long as they're fully responding to the prompt, they can get scores. So length doesn't necessarily impact scores. If it's too short to score, that may that may hurt the student if they only respond in a short answer, but then it wouldn't necessarily be a full response. So it's not necessarily due to the length, it's more about the content of the essay. Additionally, we've also seen that if students start to write longer and longer, like we see a strong first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then the students start to hit fatigue and their writing just kind of fizzles out in the end. So in that case, longer writing can also impact scoring. And Scott, I think probably have more to add to that.
Yeah, no, there's a good friend of ours, Isaac Bahar, who's at ETS, was the guy always trying to break these automated scoring systems and figuring out how he could possibly game them. And so, bigger words, oftentimes longer passages, were correlated with higher scores. But the issue is that kids who know more and understand the prompt have more to say, right? So it's correlated. And so I think, Frank, we've come such a long way in both automated and human scoring that and you have the ability to do this evaluation of the scoring that I don't think it's an issue. And I even the length of your if we did a full prompt, again, if you factor out that the kids who know more tend to write a little more, if you control for that, I would say that it's not going to make a difference. Tell your teachers to have your kids write thoroughly.
Thank you, Scott and Sid. Frank, do you have another question?
I think so. I think it's board member Lear, unless she took her hand down.
Right. Well, so this is kind of illustrated during this discussion. This is a little challenging for staff, for the state board, as we prepare a contract, because this decision point is important from a cost perspective, as well as obviously an implementation perspective. And there could be discussions with the vendor, to Jennifer's point, the timing of implementing a change like this might make sense to delay that until the standards are fully adopted by the board, taught, and then we're ready to assess those. So this type of a change again, it might make sense, even if we want to go forward with either one or both of these options, to delay that implementation for a couple of years until the standards have been adopted and have been taught for a year.
Yeah, this is it. So, Jennifer, what's the timing on the standards?
Okay, the
And
draft,
why are you causing trouble? You know.
we have too many standards. We are going to reduce, Scott. We're going to focus. So the draft should be to the board for committee decision in August.
Oh, good. Okay.
You know, it has to go to full board, but to release for the 90 days. And so we should have the final, you know, draft next school year. And then usually we give a year before people have to actually be held accountable for those. And then we'll be ready, which will be a kind of perfect timing in terms of getting this part, like what does writing look like moving forward within those standards. We'll have those standards to inform the work in preparation for kind of that of ELA standards. But the goal is to reduce the quantity of standards that we have. The big ideas of read, write, speak, and listen are still going to be there, but it is trying to get more to an integrated and less about, like, we want to know what kids should be able to demonstrate. But at this point, we have a lot of standards that we probably don't need to tell teachers that you are doing, need to do that one. So.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of refining them and making sure we have the real essential standards highlighted for our teachers.
But the current test goes through the administration in spring of 22, right?
Correct.
So we're not that far off. I see what Sid just wrote in the chat. So we have like a little gap year here. So, but it's more manageable than I feared. So I think this will be, I think we have the TAC agendas planned for the next series of meetings.
Well, let's do this before I move on to the next topic related to the RFP. Let's do a vote on this. We'll start out, and maybe Leslie, you could, or somebody on my staff could count for us. Those, and some of us on this call are voting members of the TAC. I'm not, so you won't see me vote, and others are voting members. You should know who you are. Those of you who are voting members, let's make a vote on option A, which would be to include a full write prompt at each grade. Those who would support that or believe the board should support that part of the proposal for the Cambion RFP, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll wait just a minute in case there's anyone who's struggling to find your hand.
Yeah, let us know if you're struggling to raise your hand.
Yeah.
I only see Steven so far, so.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to consider that part of the vote complete. Thank you, all of you, for considering that. Stephen, if you put your hand down. Now let's talk about option B, which would be to incorporate writing into every test opportunity through short response writing items. Those who are in favor of that, moving forward through this contract development and taking before the board, raise your hand.
One, two, three, four, five, six. Is board member Cummings a voting member? I don't know the answer.
No.
She will be at one point, but not right now.
former board member.
Oh, former board member.
Works with the governor's office now.
Okay.
No. Okay.
6.
Right. Board member Lear is also curious if she's a voting member, so it might be.
There's 2 board members who are voting members, right?
Yeah, and that would be board member Earl and board member Cannon.
Oh, I thought we were not voting members.
You are.
We are.
No, you're right, board member Cannon. You're correct. Board members, you'll vote when it has board members, but in terms of the AAPAC committee,
okay,
you're correct.
Thank you. So I still count 6 for this option B. Do you want to take a vote on the what we'll call the Cummings hybrid plan?
Yes. Yes. So our final vote on this would be to incorporate both of these options, where the full writing prompt would continue to be in 5th and 8th grade, which is required by statute. So none of our votes are to eliminate writing completely. We will go forward with 5th and 8th grade for sure, until the statute changes. But those who would be in favor of A, so I guess A and B is really that hybrid is really what we voted on B, since A has to maintain a full writing. Yeah. So we don't need to vote separately on that. Okay. Thank you very much for your time and all of your comments and discussion around that. The next part of the RFP, where vendors were given an option, were asked to provide, here's some options, was specific to reducing the length of shortening the summative RISE test. And the vendor had a recommendation. They provided, Cambium provided 2 options, and they do feel strongly about one of these. And I'll tell you which one here in just a second. So they said, reduce the length of the summative assessment blueprint, or the number of questions that we ask for each reporting category for ELA and math. And the reason science isn't on here is they said currently they've done that with the science assessment to the greatest degree they believe they can, without compromising some psychometric qualities of the test, which would result in reduced reporting category and standards level reporting at the individual student level. So currently, a student gets an individual score report, and they'll get a score, an overall score, the scale score, and they'll get a score at the reporting category level. So for each reporting category, depending on which content and grade level it is, could be 4 to 6 reporting categories. The student would get a score at those levels currently. With this option of A, the test would be shortened to some degree, and it would eliminate our confidence in being able to tell students that within a reporting category, we could tell them how proficient they are within that individual category, because the number of questions associated with that set of standards or reporting category would be reduced. Students would still get an overall score, proficiency rating, scale score, but not anything at the reporting category level. This vendor, Cambium, believes they still could provide reporting category composite scores for the classroom and at the school level. Or option B would be to develop a system of multiple opportunity assessments. This would be quite a deviation from our current delivery mode, based on a common reduced length blueprint, to where the administration would occur over the course of the year, up to 3 administrations per year. In the vendor's proposal, they recommend A as their option, but they've provided option B as well. Board Member Earl, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes. As we're moving towards more of a competency-based assessment, my understanding is this is just meant to give an end of the year broad idea of where we are. It's not meant to be, a full analysis, so to speak. And so anyways, those are my thoughts. And especially with this multi-opportunity assessment, I wonder how that affects opt-out, or if someone's choosing not to do that, does that remove that, or how does that impact that element where we're doing it numerous times throughout the year?
Yeah, so the opt-out form, when a parent selects that they want to exclude their student from the RISE assessment, it would include any administration of that assessment. So it would, they would just need to, we would need to make sure we communicate with parents early at the beginning of the year. Most LEAs, I think, do a good job of that. And parents who feel strongly about a parental exclusion, I believe the vast majority of those complete those opt-out forms early in the student's educational year. But there would be, this change would be something that would need to be communicated to families, that now exposure to these assessments that are part of our RISE system will be occurring potentially earlier in the year than what their students had experienced previously.
The thing, Darren, it's worth saying is that this, what we call through year, or multiple opportunity, or through course, it doesn't reduce the length of testing. It just spreads it out. Whereas A reduces the length of the summative test. And so that's something people have to, and in fact, something like B, what we've seen in other states, it usually lengthens the total test time of the summative assessment. So it looks like you're getting, like, it's like the old story, right? There's no free lunch. It looks like you're getting something, but you're paying the piper in, you know, in November and in February. And so this, and I just say this whole area of this notion of through year is so unsettled that at the center we're worried about it. So we're going to do what we call a pop-up conference in like October, November, to bring together the vendors in the states who are all interested in this, because it's like a runaway train right now. So.
I appreciate your comments on that, Scott, especially around the timing, because when I read their proposal, it was unclear to me of how it would reduce testing time. It was included in the reduction of testing time, context. But as I've observed this and talked to people in other states that follow a similar system, I've really not seen how it would reduce testing time. I think it's like you're saying, this analogy of if I pay my taxes in my payroll and a little bit each month or each pay period, it feels like I'm paying less taxes versus if I don't, and then in April I have a big bill that I have to write a check to the tax commission. So yeah. I remember Earl.
I think Scott answered this question for me, but it just seems to me that actually, we've got teachers that are going to want to prepare for that assessment. It seems like it's going to take additional time from the class, if that makes sense, to prepare for the test and then taking the test and then doing that several times throughout the year for that would seem like it actually extend not only the test time, I think Scott answered that, but it would also extend prep time as well as I would.
Board Member Earl, your audio broke out right towards the end. I could hear early in the question, I think we could hear concerns about teachers and preparation for the tests and it being disruptive in that way, but we couldn't hear the end of your comment.
I think that's where she ended, Darren. I think it was that there would be this ongoing test prep, never-ending test prep in a way. So I think that's what she was getting at. She could maybe chat us if that's wrong.
Okay, Jennifer.
Sorry, I just drove home and I walked in the house. It was switching different systems. So.
Okay. Thank you. Jennifer, you're next in the queue.
Yeah, with the multiple opportunities, given these are standards that are supposed to be achieved by the end of the year, how does that take into account student performance? Because if I'm taking it in November, I've had 3 months of instruction versus 9 months. It seems like there's a scope and sequence to the standards that we think we can achieve earlier. I just see a lot of issues with that.
You're singing from my song sheet. That's, it's like it doesn't develop anymore, or then that's why you end up making the end of your test a little longer than a third of the 3 tests, because you do count on these things developing. So that's.
Well, and that also, Scott, with you saying that, does that mean they'd say, well, we're going to do these standards in the first iteration, and then some of them will come back up. That would kind of tell teachers what they had to teach when in that sequence as well, right? Like, we're going to cover these math concepts. You better have covered them by November. Okay.
Yeah, people love that in Utah.
Okay. Hal, I think you're next in the queue.
I'll just say that I do like 1, but the concept of B could be different in that there's a base test that everybody gets like A. All I wish is there's hard worlds between what federal accountability lets us do and what we would like to do. And I wish that if we even pursue a little bit of B, if I elected a district or a school level to do more benchmarking or other things, it would be nice that some of the information learned from that shows favorably on the student acquiring competencies, that could be folded into additional information on the summative report, but it wouldn't change their proficiency because that would violate the feds. But it's just kind of like there is information gained that students, that people elect to take. And it's like the wall's so hard, it never shows to summative. And so I like A, but I do get frustrated by the walls that don't allow at least some of that information being brought into enhancing the final report, but maybe not changing proficiency. So I'll just throw that out. I know it's kind of a hybrid, but I still like A, but I am frustrated that we can't bring in more of that information.
Okay, thank you, Hal. Leanne, I think you're next.
So as we move towards, reducing or eliminating subscores, if we reduce reporting categories and standard level reporting at the individual student level, what value are we bringing to parents at the end when a single score, a single number, where's the value for parents in all this?
Yeah, so that's a trade-off, right? And I'm like you, Leanne. I go through the results with my children when they're done and look at the subscores. Our TAC committee would make the case that the subscores that maybe we're still, even though that we're reporting them now, that our margin of error that exists within those is in a nature that we shouldn't do that. But I know you have done that with your children, and I do that as well. Look at the subscores and compare that year to year and talk to them about the strengths and weaknesses within each content area that they might have, as illustrated through the end of year assessment. One of the things that would happen, and this came out of the work with the assessment strategic plan, is that with this change for the summative assessment, we would create a little finer grain size for our benchmark assessments, which would add value to the teachers, particularly to give them, to shift them and help them catch the vision. Kind of like what Scott, his response to Jennifer earlier on writing, and that there's other tools that we can use to inform instruction and bring about changes, is that our interim assessments and our benchmark assessments would become the tools. There's some that would say that's how it should be right now anyway, but with these changes, we would increase the grain size within our benchmarks and potentially interims that would provide information for not only teachers, but also for parents. Jennifer, your hand's still up. I assume you don't have a question. Board Member Earl, I think you're next.
Yeah, so we do realize there's a cost associated with some of this. Can you hear me still? My internet is not connecting well.
It's not great.
Yeah, intermittent.
So there, in looking at these things, you have to look at what the cost associated is too, and that we may not know the full cost, but I think they did cut down these tests and broke some of this down. And then also in the that goes out from districts, while they do have the right information there, does not limit districts, right? They can put on there. Is that accurate? In other words, talking about
yeah, did we lose?
It might be better off putting it in the chat, Board Member Earl. It's pretty tough.
We might have lost her.
Oh, she's completely gone.
Disconnected. I don't know that. Were you able to pick up much of that?
Not enough, no.
Yeah, me neither. Well, as she gets back on, and we'll try to address her questions. Are there other, before we get to a vote on recommendations from this committee moving forward with this, are there other considerations that the group should have? And I guess option C would be, again, that we don't do anything different, that we leave,
Right.
we leave things alone.
Yeah, and just for folks to, if they're not clear on A, I'm glad Cambium proposed this, is that especially given the adaptive nature of the tests so that kids see different test items, you can report these subscores at the level of where the action could be taken at the school or classroom level, which is where the value is, because as Darren said, it's hard. There's so much error at the student level. Now, I think it is fine for parents to look at it with kids, but for teachers to make decisions, they're really making decisions at the program, at the class level. So you get that with A. So I'm glad Cambium proposed that.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to remember Earl to get back in before we vote.
We can come back to it, Darren, right?
Yeah, maybe what we'll do is we'll move forward. The next set of slides is just providing updates to you, and we can have certainly discussion and questions, but there's not an action associated with it related to our participation in our assessment during this past year, different assessments. And then the center will lead us through some discussion about preliminary achievement results, which are hot off the press. This is the first week we've seen these rough results. And when I say rough, not bad necessarily, just raw. So we'll come back. We'll come back to this and give board member Earl a chance to get back in. All right. So across the country, there's a wide variation in the amount of participation in the various statewide assessments. Utah. Scott and Leslie could maybe support this. I'm assuming this is true based on what I've heard in other settings. Utah has as positive a response to our participation in statewide assessments as just about anybody around us. Scott's got his thumbs up. That's a tribute to the communities that we live in, the policies that were set forth both by our board, by our legislature, by our health department. I know there was contention over several of those, but in essence, what that resulted in is a large number of our students being able to meet in person throughout the year across our state and minimize some of the disruptions related to the pandemic. So you'll see here the percentage of participation or completion percentage for each content area for our grades 3 through 8, and we'll break these down by grade level here in a minute. But I want to point out that one of the first questions people will ask is, well, what do we get in a typical year? Well, a few years ago, our opt-out rate, so just the parental exclusion alone, that code alone was putting us close to 6%. So we were at 94% just with the opt-out code, and there are other reasons students miss statewide assessment participation. So if we dial back about 4 years ago, these are very comparable to those pre-pandemic participation or completion percentages for grades 3 through 8. Now, over the last few years, and in 2019, despite the very public challenges that we were facing with the implementation from our vendor at the time of administration of these assessments, even in that year, our parental exclusion or opt-out rate was around in the 3% range, with a little bit more. So our participation was probably close. I don't have the numbers in front of me, about 96%. So this is really astonishing to me. This completion percentage, again, we haven't broken it down yet by student groups and by geographic regions, but statewide, this is really amazing. In October, our AAPAC group talked about opportunity to learn questions, and including some of those this year to help us make meaning and have better understanding of the impacts of the pandemic disruptions. We have 110,000 students in these grades who responded to those 6 questions that we included in the assessment. And we'll go through those as this year, they'll become a valuable tool for us as we move forward. So the next few slides are just going to give you an overview of by grade level what the participation rate was. And you'll see a common trend here that the younger students, we have higher participation rates. You'll see this all the way up through 10th grade and 11th grade with the ACT test. But again, these numbers are really quite incredible. The SM1 secondary math 1 that you see there at the bottom of that chart, we have a small number of students, around 3,000 statewide, who take secondary math 1 assessment in 8th grade because they're on an advanced track for instruction. And so that's what that outlier that you see there is. Science, we'll get into writing. And if there's any questions at any time as we roll through these slides, don't hesitate to stop me. Writing, grades 5 and 8. So again, you see the trend. The older the students, the less participation we have. That just brings up questions. It doesn't provide us answers. We know that secondary schools were more likely to go into quarantine or a temporary shutdown. Some of our schools had that happen multiple times throughout the year. Secondary students were more likely to have to quarantine because of exposure to a classmate that might have had COVID than our elementary or younger grades. So those are some things that might have contributed to that, but we don't know. Utah Aspire Plus. One thing that is unique here is we have about 100,000 students in grades 9 and 10 across the state, just a little higher than that. And you'll see that the OTL, or Opportunity to Learn responses, we have 75,000 of those. That's represents almost 75% of our 9th and 10th grade students across the state, which is, again, really pretty remarkable in some regards that we have that data. And again, it will be very helpful for the work that we'll talk about later this morning. ACT, we don't actually collect participation codes on ACT. It's not delivered. The assessment isn't delivered in a way that we're able to determine why some students participated and some didn't. But we do have these numbers here. I have had one LEA, a fairly large one. In fact, Rich, I believe it was Ogden District, one of your employees told me they felt like their ACT participation was as high as they'd ever had. So we have some areas in the state, again, that as we disaggregate this data out through our analysis and investigations through the year, that might point us into areas that, again, create additional questions for us to try to answer. Dual language immersion, again, we don't typically look at how many students complete that. That test also had a remote administration option available, which we had several thousand students complete that test remotely. These are our students who are in grades 1 through 8 in a dual language immersion program. The Acadience end of year data, I don't have that yet. The kindergarten exit profile data I don't have yet. And then our WIDA assessment data for students learning English, a 91% completion percentage, which again, this is really remarkable number for our state. That's as high as I would have dreamed we could get under the conditions we had this year. WIDA test is not available for remote administration. It's a fairly intensive test administration. We had LEAs across the state that went to students' homes, that had them come in outside of hours. Just an amazing effort was made to try to gather this information, which is very important instructionally to know what students are capable of in reading, speaking, listening, and writing in the English language for their teachers that they'll have the following year. This represents our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Our DLM test, which we administer ELA math, and then science this year. We previously administered science, a UOD assessment, which was a homegrown assessment. You see those numbers are pretty close. One thing to highlight here, and this is good place to stop and talk about limitations and ways that we should be cautious about how we interpret the data that we're going to look at relationship to achievement. You see the insights there. In 2021, it's 4,090 students, and in 2019, it was 4,247 students. That's a pretty significant percentage difference or drop in students that were participating in the DLM. It creates questions for us to try to answer, and that is that expected? Are those students, have we previous to that, have we seen an increase in the statewide participation or number of students who participate in the DLM? And is a decline in the 2021 year unexpected? And if so, how do we explain that? Where did those students, did they self-select to come out of the educational setting and environment, and so forth? All right, I'm gonna, Scott, before we get to the, turn it over to you for achievement, I'm gonna go back and let's get some guidance from this committee on this area. So again, voting members, if you'll raise your hand, we'll have three options. One would be we'll leave it alone, but we've got board member Earl is back with us, and you were commenting when we lost you. So let's go back. Board member Earl, I mentioned you have some comments.
Yes, I am sorry. I apologize for the connection here. Hopefully we've corrected that.
You sound very clear right now.
Okay, good. I guess I wanted a clarification even on, because the recommendation came out to shorten the summative assessment. That was the recommendation that was made. And so I'm trying to understand the difference between shortening it and what number one provides, or A, sorry, just I'm trying to see clarification there between the two.
Okay, so A, option A here would reduce the test by some number of questions. In the proposal, they've got a list of those, and it's broken out by content area where they went through and estimated how many questions they could shorten the test and still maintain the psychometric integrity of the overall test. It was, I don't remember the number of questions. It was somewhere between 5 to 8 questions per assessment, maybe 5 to 10. So that would, option A would reduce the test, the length and the amount of time then that students would need to complete it. The cost then would be, because we pay for that with something, we would remove and not provide on the individual student score report category or standard level reporting. The student would get an overall score, scale score, and proficiency score.
Okay, so I guess my question would be then, what was the recommendation made earlier that we put out the RFP for? Because if I remember right, it was to shorten it, but still keep it long enough that certain categories were reported on?
Yeah, we need to meet the requirements set out by the U.S. Department of Education around the results associated with these assessments. And then obviously we have reasons that we want to maintain those at the state level as well. The RFP actually asked them to address the recommendations that were included in the state strategic assessment plan and provide suggestions related to those recommendations. And one of the recommendations in that strategic assessment plan was to look for ways to reduce testing time. So this is in direct response to that element that was in our state strategic assessment plan.
Okay, that's what I was trying to seek clarification on, because it seemed to be that was the recommendation that came from the strategic plan.
Yeah.
So A is reflective of that, in other words.
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, correct. And the board, when the board reviewed the recommendations in the state strategic assessment plan, accepted those recommendations. So this one's not as tricky for USB staff as we prepare a contract, but nonetheless, because there were a couple of options included in the proposal, I wanted to seek feedback from this group because that's the role of the assessment. One of the roles of the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee is to advise the board on issues related to assessment.
Okay, so the board has already approved am I accurate in saying that, the strategic plan that asked for it to be shortened? Is that in?
It was
okay.
like December or something like that. November.
Yeah, it's tricky. That's tricky. The word approved. I know there's. If we had the full board here, we'd get into a discussion around approved versus accepted. So I'm using the word. I'm sticking with the word accepted because that was the word in the minutes.
Sure. So we accepted that plan as written.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted clarification on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Darren, not to confuse things though, there could be like an A(2) with because even if we reduce it not to report all the typical subscores at the individual level, just by the way that the test is designed. So for instance, in upper elementary school, I would bet there would be enough proportional reasoning items on the math test to report a subscore in something like proportional reasoning, using that just as an example, because that's one of the big ideas in 4th, 5th, 6th grade mathematics, right? And so there's probably other, and that way you're reporting a subscore about stuff people should be focused on. So there could be, we could sort of look at this more carefully, and it shouldn't cost any more. It's a little ink on a page, and that way the kids would get some subscore or two that were relevant, most relevant, and the school would still get all the information. So Stephen's asking in the chat, would information surrounding individual student data in content areas be lost in option A? You're getting responses on fewer items, but I don't know what you mean by loss. You would certainly still have a good sense of how they're doing in 5th grade mathematics or 6th grade ELA and stuff like that. Is that what you're asking, Stephen?
Yeah, my question is, would we lose the individual student data in the content areas if we minimize the questions or reduce the questions?
But you keep in mind what Darren said, we're not talking about like cutting it in half. We're cutting out, a hand 5, 8 maybe questions just to get it down a little shorter, maybe 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour if we're lucky, but Darren's right. You first have to meet the requirements of peer review, and it's an alignment requirement. So it's not going to be short, it's not going to be like a 1 class period test. I danced around your question there, Stephen, but you'll have less information at the kid level, but I don't think you're going to have noticeably less.
Okay, so Scott, with what you said then, I guess what I would ask this committee is to weigh in on is, it sounds like option B there, when we had discussion, there wasn't support for option B. And as you pointed out, Scott, that option doesn't really address the request to look at ways to shorten and streamline the testing experience. It just distributes it differently.
Right.
So unless somebody feels contrary to that, we won't take a look at option B here. But in terms of option A, I guess what I'd be asking for is, it sounds like the committee, what I want to know is the committee support that general concept of reducing the length of the summative assessments, which, to Scott, to your point, it may still allow us to report out a category level for some of the reporting categories. But it wouldn't be the primary goal as we build the test blueprint. Our goal wouldn't be to make sure that we have enough questions for each reporting category that we would report out a proficiency level on the individual student report. Rich, go ahead.
Thanks. Maybe this is a question for TAC, Darren and Scott. Scott, what are you seeing, or Darren, nationally, when the length of a test is reduced? And I've heard it touched on, but does the standard error of measurement increase? And if that's the case, recognizing the accountability and some of the consequences, if you will, associated with low test scores, is that something we might want to keep in consideration? I mean, we talk about standard error, we talk about confidence interval. I'm just wondering if you're reducing items, the opportunity for the student to demonstrate what they know and don't know is also reduced, and therefore triggers potential consequences for certain schools, certain student populations as a result of accountability obligations as well.
Yeah. One thing for sure that we know in educational measurement is that test length is it's not perfectly correct, but it's highly correlated with reliability. So the longer the test, the more reliable, the smaller the standard error. The thing that people lose sight of is that these tests, this is true for all tests in Utah, except the ACT perhaps, are not consequential for kids. And the unit of analysis is at the school level. So way back when, my colleagues Rich Hill and Charles D. Pascali showed that you could have a test with what you would consider low reliability, like 0.5 or 0.6 at the student level, which is horribly low. But at the school level, as long as you had 50 kids at the school, you would have an effective school level reliability of over 0.9. And for those of you who don't play along with this game all the time, it's on a, reliability operates like correlation coefficients on a scale of 0 to 1.0. Anything above 0.88 is considered very good. And so I don't think and besides, these tests, because they're adaptive, are still, that's one of the beauties of an adaptive test, is that you're able to get a smaller standard error for a shorter test, but we haven't yet capitalized on that really because of all these blueprint requirements and subscore requirements. So I think we're good on the reliability thing. It's worth bringing up, Rich, for sure, but I think we're good. And Leslie, jump in if I.
And if I could just comment a little bit further on that, Scott, and I appreciate that. The more you bring up at the aggregate, the greater the reliability, right? In terms of like that 0.9 at the school level. Just trying to reconcile to some of the work that we did around that. Master planning with testing is to inform at a student level the opportunities to use some of this statewide testing in a more formative nature, and just trying to reconcile, again, for accountability purposes, that's one thing, and then that was my original point, so and you addressed that, so thank you. And at the other, trying to reconcile, well, what does this mean at the student level, and for the teacher who's welcoming kids in the classroom, they're identifying per standard reporting categories where some of the strengths and the weaknesses were of specific students that are coming into the school for the next year to tailor instruction, build up, learning progression plans, even SLOs or PGPs, performance growth plans, things like that. So just trying to reconcile between where, yes, at accountability level, are we reducing it? If we take it up in the aggregate at the school level, it's great. And also suggesting, hey, at the student level, what actionable data is here for the student, for the class.
The beauty in Utah is that you have all these interim assessments and interim, like, get the names confused, block,
benchmark.
Benchmark, thank you. That really is designed to provide that instructionally useful information. And the summative could do what it does, but that's, people have different preferences on that. But good questions, Rich, as always.
Okay, let's have our members vote on, because one option is that if we feel comfortable with our current blueprint, we feel comfortable, and I've heard some discussion today that makes me think there is some level of comfort with where we're currently at, trying to find this sweet spot or the balance of having a test that's not overly lengthy. If we let psychometricians develop our tests, we would just sit in the test room all day, right, Scott? Because it would never be too long. But balancing that with the needs of our educational settings, if we feel like that's okay, then you would vote no on this option to do A. But if you feel like we still have room to go in the state, that we could, I think, Scott, you said, trying to think of what could capitalize, that we have some room to capitalize both shortening the length and taking more advantage of the computer adaptivity related to these assessments, then you may vote for A. So just a little dialogue before we do a vote. All right. If you are in favor of staff or the state board in preparing the contract around this assessment to take to the board, in working to reduce the length of the summative assessments in ELA and math, go ahead and raise your hand.
Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I only see 6 hands.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, and not knowing how many, go ahead and take your hands down, not knowing I don't have the roster in a place I can see it. Those of you who are voting members who are opposed to that and feel like we're in a good place and just to leave things alone. So if we're opposed to option A, raise your hand.
I see 2.
I'm just noticing, this is Emily. Frank, his hand was up before. He never took it down before.
Oh, thank you for noticing that.
So I don't know,
You might
Frank,
have
if
got
you
a
want
phone
to take
call.
that down. Just to
Or-
double check the vote.
You know, we say here in New Hampshire, vote early, vote often. So maybe Frank's following that.
Frank, if you're with us, still, he might have got distracted with a phone call or somebody talking to him.
But Emily, you sure you saw it first time? Okay. And Sherry says too as well. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then it's 1 for this one.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. And we'll have a couple more issues that we'll talk about and have some votes on. I'm going to move down. I think we're at a place that taking a 5 to 10 minute break would be a good idea to give you guys each a chance to get up and walk around. So let's restart the meeting. It's 10:33. Let's restart the meeting at 10:40. So everybody wants to take a short break, and we'll see you at 10:40. Leslie, will it be you or Scott that'll be reviewing the achievement data?
It will be me, Darren. Yeah.
Okay.
So those 4 slides. Yep.
Great. And then the study, is Scott going to talk about the study that'll be right after
Yes.
those? And then growth,
Scott will do the studies.
is growth going to be Scott as well?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. How are things in Austin today?
Oh, thanks for asking. They're actually, we're in a stretch of really warm weather, which is not atypical of Texas, but I heard, actually I was on a call, actually I've been on calls almost every day with folks on your team, and it sounded like you guys hit the record 107 the other day, right?
Yeah, we did.
Wow.
They, maybe this weekend we'll get another record.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, we've been, the worst part here though is we're in an extreme, I don't remember, whatever the worst rating of drought is, we're in that right now. The whole, almost the whole state.
Wow. Yeah, that's it's been a year for weathers too. Yeah, I mean, I was just recalling, but they probably are used to this. I remember visiting Arizona a few years ago, and I think I happened to visit on a weekend where it was like 114 or 115 degrees, but apparently the week before it was even hotter. That at the airport the planes had to get delayed because the wheels were melting because of how hot it was. So hopefully you don't get that high, but yeah, it sounds like, yeah, hopefully you guys get either a cool down and some rain, or maybe hopefully both soon.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad things are calm, and you're just warm though in Austin. Nothing.
It's just warm. Yeah, I wouldn't call it unseasonably. We actually got quite a bit of rain the past month. So so it's actually more humid than usual. But it sounds like people would much rather have the rain and it'll be a little humid than being hot and also dry. So again, hopefully that some of that rain will be sent your way.
Yeah. Soon. Yeah, send it up.
So.
Okay, we are back at 10:40, maybe even 10:41. Looks like. You never can tell if everyone's back to their computer or not when you're in these virtual settings. But we'll go ahead and get started because I get optimistic, Scott, that I can get through everything on the agenda and all my slides, and I'm not sure now that we're into the meeting quite a ways. we'll be pushing it.
Well, we're actually on time, which is, well, no, we're
Oh,
not.
with the agenda?
No, we're on time with the break, but we're not on time with the agenda. The break was on time.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope that most of our group has come back, and I'll turn the time over to Leslie, who's going to review some of our preliminary RISE and Utah Aspire Plus results.
Yeah, thank you, Darren, and hi, everyone. So yeah, there's only 4 slides here to kind of give you a preview of what the results will look like. Like Darren said, this is really hot off the press. Cambium actually shared their results for RISE, which we'll show in the first few slides a couple of weeks ago, and then Pearson shared their results for Utah Aspire Plus this Monday, but they literally had just finished doing their equating on Friday, so last Friday, so a week ago. So a lot of this is truly preliminary, and I believe both vendors are doing their QCing, and they also mentioned, of course, as Darren shared, that this doesn't represent all the kids that necessarily tested this year, but it does represent most of the kids. I think Cambium quoted something like 95% of kids who tested are represented in this data. I also want to just reiterate, I really appreciate Darren mentioning this, that as we get ready to look at these results, it is important to keep in mind those participation rates that Darren just went, because one of the things that I think Scott will get to after we share these results is that these results are as they are. They are for the kids that did test, but we have to keep in mind that there are also students who did not test. And it's also important to know if those students are not what we call missing at random, there could be things in here, even if the results look optimistic or similar, we want to keep that in mind as we sort of go over these results. So with all that kind of, framing in mind, we'll just go right into the data. So what you're seeing here is the preliminary results for the ELA assessments and from grades 3 through 8, as you can see here. What Cambium was able to do, and initially they actually shared it all the way back to the start of SAGE in 2014, but the TAC actually advised that it may be better just to look at the more recent years, so that so you're looking at a more comparable comparison. So what you see here is the first 3 bars in each of these graphs represent 17, 18, and 19. Of course, testing was suspended in 20, so there is no 20 data. And then the last bar here is what they're seeing in terms of percent proficient, so percent at or but proficient at each of these grade levels. So the trend you're seeing here across the board that Cambium pointed out is that there does seem to be a modest decrease in ELA, especially at the lower grade level. It seems to be a little more similar at the higher grade levels. That it's especially if you look at grade 8, it almost seems to have performance is very similar for ELA. Darren, if you want to go to the next slide. For mathematics, there's actually a decrease across the board. And in terms of magnitude, they tend to be a little larger than what you were seeing in ELA. So in terms of ELA and math, this trend is actually similar to what some of the earlier studies, some of the intern vendors such as Renaissance and NWEA had looked at their preliminary results back in the fall from their interim assessments. And they were also, the primary trend that came out of those was there did seem to be a modest decrease in ELA and a more significant decrease in math. So this is what we're seeing here in Utah is actually quite similar to that trend that had been observed earlier. Next slide, please. Now for science, this is interesting. You do see, of course, we only have the middle grade school levels here, and only for the last 2 years since the new assessment has been implemented. And what you do see, there's a slight decrease in grade 6, but in 7 and 8, the proficiency rate seems to be holding steady. By the way, Cambium's results actually also included, they had a lot more results than this, but I just kind of summarized it to 3 slides. They also showed average scale score change. They also showed these results by different student groups. And again, a lot of the trends just, are well presented with the percent proficient. So I just kind of use these to show that. So it is interesting that science has sort of held steady. I think as we kind of get into trying to explain these results, especially with what Scott's going to show you later, it will be interesting to look at why there are some of these differential results in each of the content areas.
Maybe everybody paid more attention to science over the last year with things like experiments and vaccines and right.
Right, and Anne Michelle noted that maybe last year it was also more eventful, earthquakes, destructive windstorms. So maybe those all drew people's attention to things like earth sciences and other scientific things. So this is the results for Utah Aspire Plus. Pearson actually put everything on one graph, so I just went ahead and took it. The way to kind of look at it, there's a lot of numbers on this chart, but the way if you want to just squint your eyes, I think the most relevant thing to look at is sort of the length of the bar that's at the blue and gray area, because that represents the percent of kids that are at or above proficiency. So that's sort of the comparable to what we were showing with the RISE results. And generally, because Aspire Plus has only been given for, well, it was given in 19 and then given again in 2021. So there's only 1 year to compare it against. And if you really squint your eyes, the pattern is if you see a longer bar with the blue and gray for 19 and a shorter bar for 2021, that means a decrease in proficiency rate. So to me, I don't know why my mind has to always kind of shift my thinking around when I'm looking at this. So if it goes down, if the bar shrinks, that means there's less proficiency rate. So what you see across the board here, and you don't have science here because science is, was given under the new standards for the first time. But for math, reading, and English, you generally also see a decrease in proficiency rate. There is one exception, and this is something that is still, that Pearson admits that they're still looking into for an explanation. Reading grade 10 actually increased slightly in terms of their performance. So it went from about 48% proficient to about 51%. So about a 3% increase in proficiency for reading at grade 10. That was not observed in grade 9. And so there's still, again, this was really hot off the press. So they're still trying to come up with an explanation for why kids seem to be doing better in reading in the 10th grade in 2021.
Yeah, and Leslie, let me pause for a second. If we remember to participation, if we went back to those participation slides, the 10th grade, as we progressively got fewer and fewer students participate in the assessment. In 10th grade assessment, I think it was around 82% participation. Yes. So, one of the reasons that the U.S. Department of Education some time ago put in this 95% rule is because it's possible for an educational entity to game their accountability system by targeting certain students that they either want to include in the assessment or don't want to include in the assessment. Now, obviously, that didn't happen here. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the reason that it's important to have equal participation from all of our students, student groups across the state, is by taking strategically, somebody who's got bad intentions could strategically remove certain students, and automatically their overall averages would go up. So again, remember that 10th grade, we had 18% of our students that didn't participate, and we need to look further into that to determine who those students were. And that will help us be able to get more context and answer questions like some might have right now of how's that possible? How could reading proficiency improve during a pandemic when students are interacting with teachers in different ways that many people felt like were less effective ways?
Yep, Darren's right on, right? And that actually is one of the things I think the TAC brought up is, and again, Darren mentioned earlier, really looking at these results with the lens of participation. And yeah, Darren did point out, I think earlier, one of the slides Darren shared did show that the participation rates at, for Utah Aspire Plus was in the 80% range. So it's, you really want to find out who are the kids that are missing. And that's something that's definitely first worth investigating.
Yeah,
there was also,
Leslie, we've got a couple of questions or people with hands up. Should I introduce them?
Yes, please.
Now? Okay.
Yeah, this was the last slide, so I'm done. So, yep.
Okay, Board Member Earl.
Yeah, I just wonder, and I'm sure they do this, Aspire Plus does this, but I mean, 2019, 2021, the amount of students in level 1 is significantly high. So I guess what I'm asking is, I'm sure they're looking to say, are we actually assessing this correctly? Do you know what I mean? That's a pretty high, nobody made this, for the math grade 10. Did I clarify that? So that particular area, those that are not proficient at all, or I guess it's the level 1s, are really, really significant high. So I guess that what I'm asking is hopefully they're asking, are we asking the right questions, right? Are we drawing in on the right items? So as much as it's us, wouldn't it also be Pearson having to evaluate that element? Because it doesn't fully align with our standards, so to speak, because this a national assessment?
It's
I don't know,
half
maybe
and half.
Half and half, okay.
Yeah, and let me clarify that part, and then Scott or Leslie, I'll let you answer the first part if I remember Earl's question. So the test itself, the construction of the test includes items that come out of the ACT item bank that allows us, or ACT Aspire item bank, which allows us to have this linkage and provide the predictive ACT score. But we don't use any items out of the ACT item bank, ACT Aspire, excuse me, item bank that are not aligned with Utah core standards. And so in particularly with math, it was challenging for us to construct the test. So Scott, when you said it's about half and half, that's generally true, but in math, I can tell you that's not true. It was more challenging to find ACT Aspire items that were aligned with our 10th grade math. And so it's fewer items that are ACT Aspire items in 10th grade math and more items that are Utah developed items.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Board Member Earl, your concern is worthwhile. I would have to go back though to look at what the performance was in these lower, how many kids were in these lower levels on the end of course tests. So one of the challenges, you noted that you called it national, but like we said, it's like half and half. But the issue is, it's every ninth grader takes the same test. So you could be in, first year calculus, and I could be in remedial pre-algebra. We're taking the same test. And so it would be worthwhile to go back and see how kids performed on the end of course tests relative to that lowest performance level. But some of it is what we call differential course taking. They're just they haven't had an opportunity to learn some of this stuff for some of these kids.
Okay, I guess we're not seeing the same thing though in math 9 that significant jump of improficient. So thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. We've been investigating our math data just this week, and so there is a pattern that the percentage in ninth grade who fail ninth grade math, then it increases the percentage that fails in 10th grade, but they're likely to continue to fail the future year. So the fact that it grows makes sense in terms of if they didn't get it in ninth grade, it builds upon those basic concepts in 10th grade. And our state data from like credit earning side of this is very similar to this kind of growing from 9th to 10th grade.
Thank you, Jennifer. Aaron, I think you're next in the queue.
Thank you. I just want to talk about participation rate and just share, if that's all right. It's slightly complex when we talk about the Utah Aspire Plus, because the participation rate, as I understand what was presented by Leslie, was this is the data that the vendor shared back with us, saying of the files that were submitted from our UTREX enrollment information into the vendor's testing system. This is the percentage of test results that they have. So when we look at those participation rates, I believe that's how those calculations are done. When we as a state do the official participation rates for ESSA, meaning the federal regulations, there's a different application of rules, because we also have to look at what students actually were in courses to be held accountable for that participation rate. So if you see a different participation rate in the future, just realize that different business rules get played into at different places along the path. I just wanted to clarify that, because it is very difficult to just say, and this is what it is. And I know you say, it's big, bold, this is preliminary results here. Just sharing too the concerns is because actually we do need to take the students' test and look at the course, and then make sure those students are enrolled in a course throughout the entire year, then are held accountable that they actually took the test, because there are a lot of students who might not actually be taking one of these courses that require a test. Give you a simple example. You could have a student who's homeschool half the time who comes into the high school to take, for example, they could be taking like band or drama or something like that, or something that's available at the high school that their homeschool is not offering. They still take the test. So anyway, just wanted to share that clarification too.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Yeah, the preliminary and the raw, I can't overstate how important it is for us to contextualize that typically we wouldn't be reviewing data at this point in the year. We would, at the state level, LEAs, classroom teachers, I would expect every year they've downloaded their results from these different platforms for their students and their classes and are using them. But typically, because of this connection to our assessment to accountability, we would be still several months away from doing anything with our statewide data, because we haven't processed it and applied all the business rules that are associated with it. The fact that accountability has been removed from our requirements this year allows me to be more comfortable in sharing these preliminary results. But what Aaron said is just, I can't overstate that. It's one of my biggest worries as we start talking and sharing data this early in the year, that people will misinterpret and misuse the information that we're providing. So thank you, Aaron. Jennifer, I think you're next.
I interjected. I can put my hand down.
Okay. Board Member Earl.
So and maybe Director Thronson can answer this. So we're saying that when we get our ACT scores, that there's a similar correlation with grade 9 math, grade 10 math. So the ACT scores, and I don't know what's considered a level 1 on the ACT, but we're seeing a similar, that grows. We're seeing a similar growth pattern there with those who are leveling out at 1.
Not with ACT. We haven't looked at that yet, but with just being able to pass and earn credit in secondary math 1, 2, 3. So
okay.
if I fail as a 9th grader secondary 1 and I go on to take secondary 2, the likelihood that I'm going to earn credit in the initial trial of that grows with my failure in 9th grade to not pass in 10th grade, if that makes sense. Hopefully.
And then I have a question based on what Aaron said about a student who is taking a couple of classes from the high school. They're required to then take all the assessments. Did I misunderstand that? Or they are included in the non-participation because they wouldn't participate? I'm sorry, it was a little confusing to me. I don't know if there's a clarifying answer to that.
Darren, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, please. Okay,
so the difference between the RISE assessments and the Utah Aspire Plus assessment is this. The Utah Aspire Plus is every 9th grader and every 10th grader. It is not dependent upon your course. Okay. Your 9th grade or 10th grade, you get put into, you take the assessment, where the RISE is an end of course in language arts, math, or science.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I didn't make that transition. That should have made sense, but for some reason I didn't make that transition. Thank you.
Okay, Hal, I think you're next.
Thank you. I have been looking at our initial results in Canyons, but I've been looking at it all year. And so let me tell you just some background of where my caution all comes from. And that is, we do a reading inventory mid-year benchmarking, and it's pretty casual. They have a remote test option. And we had several TSI schools looking at their results. They were testing around 80% of their students, and they're going, look, our results aren't so bad. And I go, there's 20% of your students that you're not testing because they're online learners and not wanting to participate. Our trend in, at least at our middle school, which is some of our easiest data to look at, is that those that chose to go online were disproportionate lower income, disproportionate Latino, and other types of characteristics, and we don't know the family reasons for that. As I looked at end of year benchmarking, we have a disproportionate number of low income, disproportionate number of special ed students that were not participating in end of year testing even though, well, end of year benchmarking for our district, even though more of them are proportionally coming back to in-person learning. So when I see even 90% or 88%, we have to go back and longitudinally follow the students that aren't tested and say 2 years ago, what was their performance? And I want it modeled to say, if I add in 3% more, what statistically, what would be that confidence interval and range of that impact? Because if we're disproportionately putting in struggling students, these overall results are going to be lower. And I think it'll bear out in the fall when we come back full force, hopefully. So I've been telling my schools to always keep in mind those students who are not being tested and those students that were more disproportionate to go to online, and they are not representative. And I don't know if that pattern is true statewide. So that's only one perspective of one district. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hal. And it's actually a great transition. You remember earlier in the meeting, we talked about recommendations from this group back in October, or back in February. And I think Scott's going to lead us through this additional work that we're going to do to address some of the things you're talking about, Hal.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take this. Darren, I just chatted to you. We're going to have to think about adjusting the agenda because I don't think we're getting through everything unless people had nothing planned for the rest of the day. I'm kidding. So anyway, several of you asked questions related to this, and to the staff, the leadership at the department and the board themselves, they've launched this pretty extensive, as you'll see, extensive, I'm not underestimating that, sets of analyses to really try to understand what happened to kids over the last 15 months. And I want to say something that's really important, because as you know, we work in states. We probably work in 40 states now. Not that many states are doing this in this kind of deliberative way. Some states are trying to rush some analyses out this summer before they report scores, and so they can feel good about them. But to really dig in and investigate what happened to kids, what happened to schools, it requires a pretty intensive examination. And so the board's goals are to, first of all, document these overall trends in participation and achievement, to see if we're able to identify, not in a causal attribution way, but identify districts and schools that have been most affected, and then see what's been the effect of the pandemics, depending on how you consider it, on already existing achievement gaps. And then we collected opportunity to learn measures. We'll talk more about those and see whether that helps us understand the test score information and other things like that. So we go to the next slide.
Just a second.
Sorry.
Get my mouse in the right place.
So, one of our mantras in statistical analysis, if you would have taken basic stats from me, you would have heard this. And, one of the leaders in our field, Tukey, always talks about this importance of describing exploratory data analysis. And so we say description before inference and inference before evaluation. My wife gets sick of me when I tease her when, we read something and she makes this causal inference. And I was like, all right, you're like super inference. It's like leaping to a causal inference in a single bound, right? We have to, and then it usually is a quiet few minutes after I have to apologize. But you have to actually understand the data so carefully. My mentors really just hammered this home. Look at the data in as much descriptively as you can before you start making any inferences about cause or things like that. So that's the plan here. Let's go to the next slide. And then importantly, right, if you just look at a statewide picture, you're going to miss a lot. And so all the analyses will be done at the state level, but then they'll all be disaggregated, depending on the analysis to the extent possible for all these breakouts, if you will, and any relevant intersections. What I mean by intersection is content area by grade would be an intersection. So certainly there's, as Leslie just showed you, there's differences between ELA and math. There's differences certainly in participation as we see across grade levels. We know that schools are important, as is district. Subgroup is critically important, subgroups of students. The region, the more urban or front range districts compared with the more rural districts. And then this is not as big a deal in Utah, but we did have some districts who were remote for a good chunk of the year. So let's see if learning model makes a difference. And so there's a series of questions. I won't torture you with reading every single one, but we start with participation. Actually, there's now a question 0 that we realized we left out, and the question 0 is really who's enrolled. This is just, it's one thing to say that we had 93% participation, but if that 93% is of 95%, then that 93% is really lower when you consider the enrollment. So what I mean by that is, let's say on average, let's say there's 50,000 kids grade level in Utah, but if this year there were only 45,000 kids on average enrolled, that would be now dealing with a different set of kids. We don't have that big of a problem in Utah. We've seen some of the data. Aaron's been able to pull those data, and we're still waiting for follow-up counts. So enrollment's really the first level. Who's even here? Who's in the schools? And then who participated in the assessments? And again, all those the breakouts. And then once we know who's participated, how do these kids perform? And then this notion of a fair comparison. My friend Andrew Ho has been getting a lot of mileage out of his 3 metrics, and one of them is this notion of a fair comparison, and that's we look at the kids that we could match from 2019 to 2021, and so we're not worrying about kids who dropped out or didn't drop out. It's still tricky because, really, like, think about it, we can't take anyone younger than 5th grade, because to match them, they would have had to have a 3rd grade test. So we lose the 3rd and 4th graders there. And similarly, we lose kids on the older end. But for certain kids in the middle grades, it is going to help us. And then can we tell anything about learning model? So let's go to the next one. And so we're, like I said, we're collecting a whole variety of opportunity to learn information. And opportunity to learn is this construct that's been around, actually, when I started looking into this year. I've been writing a lot about this. It's not as old as I thought. It's only about 50-year-old construct. And it's this idea, what type of instruction, facilities, other types of supports do kids have so they're able to actually engage and learn the content. And so in this case, we ask questions about, for the remote kids, for instance, if you were remote, did you have high quality internet service? Did you have a dedicated computer? Did you have a place to work in your house? For kids who were in school, did you find that the requirement to wear a mask, keep social distance, affect your learning? Do you feel like you learned less this year? So there's a whole bunch of opportunity to learn questions that we're going to look at to help us contextualize the results. And then, we sort of keep working down through this, and eventually, do we see schools where we see increases or less, smaller decreases in academic outcomes? The case where the schools did best, where they were all the wealthier schools where every kid had a device and good internet service, or the smaller schools where they were able to be in school more often and we're able to space kids out effectively. So that's some of what we'll look at. And then, the converse of that is, are there schools where their performance declined more than we would have expected? And because that would be a place where you'd want to intervene and direct some resources. So I think go to the next. So we have a lot of data. This is Utah has no shortage of data. So we have assessment information, I call test-based information, ranging from early childhood all the way up to career and technical education. We're going to focus most, as you might imagine, on what we feel like are the most trustworthy data sources, and that's the RISE, Aspire Plus, and ACT, as well as Access and DLM. But we also have, as I just mentioned, this non-test-based information, these opportunity to learn surveys. Actually, it's a typo there, of students. We have graduation rate. We have credits earned and credits attempted. That's an important one. And so, we'll bring a lot of data to bear to this investigation. Let's go to the next slide. So that was the last slide. So this study is, the data are coming in. It's going to take a while to get all this organized. And then, one of the challenges is, of course, is when you have a lot of data sources, you often get, not let's say conflicting, but they don't always tell the same story. And so to be able to tell this story, if you will, in an appropriate and nuanced way, without just picking out the headline conclusion, is the work. And so we'll be working on this through the fall. I asked you this the other day. It shows how bad my memory is, Darren. I think we said November sometime that this report was due. Or maybe I just tried to forget it because it was sooner than I wanted, but
yeah, it's again, there's the psychometrician in you one more time too.
Exactly.
Now, this is exciting work, and we're very grateful the board has allocated funding from ESSER state administrative funds to help us accomplish this, to bring in additional resources and expertise through the Center for Assessment. We never get things as quickly as we'd want, but in late fall, early winter, this work will be completed, and a comprehensive report, an executive report, will be provided and shared with our board and shared with the public. This committee then, so the next time we're scheduled to meet in October, it's likely we'll be able to be given an update on the progress of this work. So it's something that you can look forward to the next time that we meet, hearing more about. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, this is really exciting work, and much more detailed and comprehensive than almost any other state that I know of.
Okay, so our TAC group, as I mentioned earlier, they met in April, and they had some recommendations to the state board, which we typically bring those recommendations to AAPAC, and then AAPAC onto the board for consideration. Some of the recommendations that we get from TAC and even AAPAC are the kind that don't need board approval. They direct staff and help us function, and other ones are specifically designed for the board. These recommendations are related to reporting the data and the results that we get over this coming, not just the study that we're going to do, but I mentioned earlier, we still have the school report card data display tool, and we have the data gateway, two structures that have been designed to share information and be transparent with the public. They're both widely used and well-known applications that members of our community, many members of our community, have a history of going to when they have questions about student achievement or the school report card, additional indicators of student success or school success. So what TAC recommended is that we avoid misleading comparisons and interpretations of aggregate results. Some TAC members felt so strongly as to not publish results in a way that you could look for, as board member Cannon pointed out earlier, this longitudinal comparison. Now, what we shared a few moments ago, we do look at longitudinal comparisons because it I don't know if it's necessary or not, but for me, it helps me feel more comfortable in understanding what I'm looking at to be able to look at previous results. The next thing that they talked about was to provide thoughtful support for communicating about test scores. I think that one's really not debatable. What might be interesting for us to discuss is what kind of communication would the AAPAC group recommend going forward. And then finally, to make sure that we focus on participation rates and be cautious about over-interpreting results. One of the recommendations they made, which we have not done previously, we typically publish participation rates on the school report card, but not at the student group or these other distribution or groups. We don't typically publish participation rates at that level. So the questions that I wanted to discuss briefly, we've got 43 minutes left. And the last item on our agenda, Scott, to your point, we can cut that one out if necessary. It's not time sensitive and it doesn't require any action from the AAPAC committee or the board at this time. So this question, and then as we go into restarting accountability, I think we'll have time to get through those two items, which I think would be the most pressing. So due to concerns regarding historical comparisons, should USB publish 2021 RISE and Utah Aspire data on the school report card and data gateway? So I throw that question out. Internally, we're having discussions about that. I'll be honest with you at this point, internally, a lot of our feelings are, let's wait and see. Let's, we've seen the data we saw today, both on participation rates and achievement, give us more confidence that these two tools might still be methods that we could share data with the public, which we have a responsibility to do. But it may be too early to tell, and that's certainly something that a position we could take here as AAPAC as well. So we'll stop with question one and open it up for discussion.
And Darren, could you maybe helpful for folks who aren't in that gateway and SRC stuff? The audience for this is those who work in the schools, districts, is not, or is this the general public as well?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking that, Scott. There's two functions with the data gateway, the landing page and the tools. Several tools that have been developed by Aaron and his team are public facing, so they're available for the public, the general public. They're tools that the local media oftentimes goes to when they're doing stories on student achievement, if they don't come directly to staff or the state board. And then there is a login, so teachers can log into that, and below that level is secure data that connects to teachers, so they can look at their class results in a normal year, pre-COVID year, and eventually post-COVID year. We would publish student growth percentiles. After that would be displayed in the data gateway. Obviously, this year we're not calculating a single year student growth percentiles, so that data wouldn't be in there anyway. And then the school report card obviously is just a general public, no secure element to that. Board Member Earl.
Well, I think we have to be cautious. I do feel like we need to be publishing something, and maybe it's not the comparison data. I know currently you can put in two different schools, right? Make a comparison kind of a thing. So maybe there's some of those pieces that are maybe restricted for this year, but I think we owe it to educators and the public in general to have a general understanding of what was successful. I think there is a need for communication though, and some element of this is the participation rates like we've talked about here, and as we dive deeper into that. But I do feel like that information is there's value in that. So anyways, those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Remember, Earl. Does anyone else have thoughts they'd like to add to that topic about the data gateway and school report card? Hal?
I would just say somehow something needs to be reported. And I struggle with how it looks. But the districts, we are under pressure as we try to see decreases, quote unquote, with all of the things that are even hard to quantify, to still say, do we have some decline differences that are similar to a pattern of the state or not? Or are they different. And I understand the complexity is probably increased tenfold, but I would love, as at least an early idea or a thought, maybe a standalone report that would go through all of these steps that basically through this ESSA analysis to say this many people less tested, this was how they are in groups, this is previous performance, and then do the standalone results for this last year with this qualifier and context, and then finish out kind of going forward and have it as a standalone report that could be linked to some of these things. But I wouldn't put it in the standard way. I'd have it as a standalone report of the data and not put 2018 and 19 and other things. But I think that would force people to have a sensitivity, or at least reporters or district superintendents to see it in that context. And if you did that right, it would help us as we local districts try to figure out our own reporting and messaging. Some model like that would be very helpful, but we are under pressure to start talking about these things. And I know it's a complex discussion. Thank you.
So Hal, let me ask a clarifying question. The standalone report, is it your opinion that you've alluded to the fact that you need, even the LEAs need to have the state comparative data to be able to talk to your stakeholders about how Canyons, for instance, students performed against students in the state or the state averages. The standalone report you're talking about, is it your thought that that would be comprehensive of all LEAs in the state?
I hadn't gone there yet in my own thinking. My ideal is, again, with Scott and the Center of Assessment, that you could do like a color scale of what's the confidence of the data on different reports. So fourth grade math, we feel okay about at the aggregate state level, or because of these participation or other concerns, especially in Aspire Plus, that it has a red color with qualifiers that are more strong, and that yellow or some other idea is more moderate qualifiers, and green is third grade, pretty close to the previous participation rates we feel pretty good about. But I wish there was some coloring or notation that could help put in context where our risks are and concerns. And I wouldn't want to speak for other districts about whether to do districts that way. But eventually we're all going to be reporting, and the more tools that the state can provide and the center would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Aaron.
Thank you. I was just going to comment on what Hal just said too. Then I have another comment. We are doing a big comprehensive review of the impact of COVID this year that the Center for Assessment is helping our staff here at USBE do. So, and Darren's been leading that for an entire year. And I know we presented those items. I wonder if that will cover what Hal is suggesting, where we have that document saying for this year, here are the impacts. Make sure that we include things like that. So just throwing that out is, yes, there's a plan to go through and do an intensive evaluation of the impact. And I was just going to share the other side.
Aaron, we did talk about that a little bit, but I don't think the timing is going to work because the study is going to take longer than when people want data, unless you're able to not release data till the late fall.
I agreed. And so I'm just throwing that out as well. We are doing the one work.
Right.
Anyway, on the second side too, obviously we release data when Darren and the assessment team, the board says, release it, make it available. In addition to the school report card and the data gateway. Again, the data gateway is an interactive report where it's designed to look at it, basically by district or by school, and you can jump from year to year inside of there. We also have on the state board's website in the data and statistics section, our data results page. We have researchers, interested individuals, reporters, graduate staff, just, a myriad of people always asking for information. And we always point them to that website, which has an assessment page in there and Excel spreadsheet that it's not the data gateway, but it has basically an Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs of all that information in aggregate, and with the disclosure avoidance filters put in place where small group sizes are either recoded to a range or just masked over with like an N less than 10. So just sharing it, there's multiple ways that we make this information available. And just the fact that there's such a heightened interest publicly of what's happened this year that I know we can't, when I say we can't, we could say, no, we're not going to share data, but we'll get request after request for years from here on out.
Yeah.
Board Member Earl.
In my mind, there's even another issue that's going to come up quicker, and that's the grant funding for the ARP, the ESSER 3 funding. Districts are needing information, and it sounds like some of that preliminary information is there already, but they need that in order to actually address the primary issues that are, the primary needs that they need to address and use that money for. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's August 20th, they have to turn that into us. So it's the first part of August when they've got to be requesting funds so they can overcome whatever learning gaps or whatever the impact was from COVID. I don't know whether public release or what needs to happen, but that information is going to have to be public in some capacity, because districts have to take that to a public meeting in order to get it approved. So I don't know what the balance is there, but I really think, I think erring on the side of providing information versus not having enough information for the public and districts to make decisions to benefit students and families. Those are just, once again, my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think Board Member Earl, your comments today also reflect what's in policy, board policy and statute. So the will of the board, this board and previous boards, that we are transparent with our community. And so that need exists fully. So question 3 on the screen is really related to question 1, and maybe they could be folded in together. So let me bring that one up. If USB can prominently include participation rates, or Hal, your suggestion that in some way we display levels of confidence that we have about different data elements. So for instance, if on a school report card, use that as an example, if my kids, Mountain Crest High School, if their participation rates were such that we had elevated concerns, that we had some kind of a disclaimer that showed up very prominently, or a level of confidence meter around the data that just causes people that go there to pause and say, oh, this is different. Why would they include this information here? Cause them to stop and think. We know that when we include a text each year on the school report card, we've included text, including when we had to do analysis around the 2019 data, we had some disclaimer language on there. And we know it's not common that people will click into that and read extensive, even just a few paragraphs of text. But if we had some way to prominently display N sizes or participation rates, and also, like you said, Hal, I thought that idea is worth considering, some indicator in the report card and the data gateway to give people pause when they look at the data. Do you think that would resolve anyone's concerns with using those two tools to display the data that we have this year? Aaron, is your hand still up, or is it up again?
I also have a comment on this, but if Aaron's up, let him go.
Okay, he's down.
It's down.
Okay. So, one of the things that I heard another state doing, and I can't remember which one, but I thought it was brilliant. They are producing the enrollment stats and the participation rates and releasing that to the public like 2 weeks before they release test scores. So for people who want information, that's going to be the only game in town for a couple of weeks. And it's almost going to force them to look at it. And, obviously it should have some narrative accompanying it to how people should look at this stuff, and why it's important to look at this. But as well as I do, if you give them the scores and the participation rate at the same time, they're going right to the scores, and then you're like trying to play catch up with them. So I thought this was, I think it was Nebraska. Maybe it wasn't, but I was just so impressed. It's a really smart idea.
Yeah,
It's like the Disney Plus approach, releasing one episode at a time. So
yeah. Or only putting the peas on the plate before the good stuff.
Yeah. Okay, Leanne.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciated as when you first presented the participation rates, it was like, wow, this is great. It's almost the same, without an understanding as to the conversation a lot in the chat too, with how talking about, we didn't have as many, we didn't have the subgroups participating. So I really like that opportunity of educating first and then talking about results, just as you did in this presentation. You kind of gave us the big picture and then presenting that, because it really swayed how I perceive those participation rates, understanding the holes of what we don't know yet.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Leanne. Hal?
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say that I literally had 2 weeks after our school year finished, my board president asked for results. So because we've talked about a year of the effects of COVID and achievement. So I'm just saying that we can hold off some board discussions for July, but come August, we are going to be so.
So I appreciate the comments of board member Earl and others, that the reality is in August, we're going to have tremendous pressure to have to talk about this. So I think a PDF report and no Excel files really submitted to the public, I think that we need to, like Scott says, however it goes out, it does need to go pretty rapidly, but put it within at least a 5-page report that people have to read about these issues, and not just an Excel file, and not in an interactive way that is fast. I think we need to go a little more old school and minimize the message in a very controlled way. Thank you.
So how to Scott's suggestion about providing the participation and enrollment information ahead of time, is that something also that you feel like would be helpful?
That'd be great, but you guys are at the state level, but I need it in July because August is going to come like a swarm of how are we looking? So yeah, we're just we've all set the stage for this what happened conversation. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I think training of board members, training of the public, training of key stakeholders would also be really great strategically.
Okay, thank you. Sherry?
So I agree that the data needs to be included for transparency's sake. Scott, I very much like the idea of maybe forcing people into this by sending something out a couple of weeks in advance. But I know our patrons, they're probably not going to do that. Wait for the 2 weeks, see what the data is on the data gateway, and make all their conclusions, which would be errant at that point. Is there any way to code the data gateway such that I couldn't get into the data until I had seen the disclaimer for 2021, stating that, hey, our subgroup participation was low in these groups. Remember, like, caution. And then that perhaps stayed there, forever, whatever. So that when we come back, 5 years later and go, oh yeah, that happened in 2021. But I think it almost should be a gateway. You can't even get into the data until you've looked at the disclaimer. I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, so it's sort of like you can't download this app until you agree to the terms and conditions, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would be looking at, who knows if they'll read it, but they at least have to see it. I don't know if, Aaron could program that in so quickly. That's the challenge.
It at least slows them down a little bit and makes them think, and there's no bypass.
Right.
Aaron, do you want to respond to that, or just want to think about it?
I'm going to listen to what the recommendation of the APAC group is at the end, and we'll do whatever we're requested to do. I think it's a good idea. Could we put like a filter or a block in front of it? I'm sure we could. It's basically an extra page type of thing that we can work with our IT team to do. Exactly how it's going to work, I have no idea yet. But again, we're listening to what the recommendations that come from the APAC meeting is on this, and we'll do that.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. Board Member Earl.
I just think, I think we know that there's going to be differences this year. I think in trying to create too easy of a landing, we actually are creating more problems for ourselves. I think the sooner it gets out there, we can talk about it, we can move on and actually start the school year. I think in delaying too much, anyway, that's my opinion. I don't think we need a specific landing page that says you have to go here and okay this, and then you can move on. We're not going to be any different than any other state. I'm convinced of that. As a matter of fact, we may do better than some other states. And I don't know that now, but we opened up, we went in person. I dare say we're going to have groups that did poorly. But I would caution us about being too cautious to the point where, I don't know. I think the information, let's get out there, deal with it, move ahead. I'm kind of that's just my opinion. Do what we can. I think we still create a framework around it, or I don't know if disclaimer is the right thing, but how to articulate it and how to read it, and maybe sending it out early, but I wouldn't spend too much time over thinking this too much. And maybe I'm wrong in thinking that, and maybe that's an error, but I just think people understand this. I think they're expecting it, but they want to know where we're at. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Earl. Our participation, our preliminary participation rates would support what you've just said to some degree. A level of caution that we have, while it still exists, it's not as extreme as in some of our neighboring states where their data set is much less complete. All right, let's talk about number 2 so we can move in and have some time left in our meeting for Scott to talk about accountability implications for, calculating growth, looking outward. And this is probably particularly for our LEA representatives that are in APAC. What communication tools or resources do you need for administrators, teachers, and parents to support appropriate interpretations? How you mentioned training as an idea when you were talking. Are there any specific recommendations that you would make for us to go into development on and try to produce that could support you in your role as you start to talk about the 2021 achievement data? Go ahead, Hal.
I just know that if you send out through the Superintendent's Association and local boards some, 2 to 4 page key things that aren't too hard to digest, but still hit the topics, that several things like that do get attention and get reviewed. So whether you have it as a set thing, even just good documents to talk about it with some of the data points, whether it's scattered over a few weeks to try to start the messaging, that's helpful. So at least when we are having to talk to our principals and the board, we're all seeing these same kind of messages and resources. So they don't have to be complicated in big messages, but they need to be more detailed than just a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint does not capture what's happened and our qualifications, but we should expect people to have to read a 1-page discussion of stuff or 2 pages of it. So at least we're covered of saying we've tried to keep people understanding that. I am more of a believer of some gatekeeping around it. I think we need to practice and train people to think that way for this year. we can be proud of what we've done, but I think we can qualify so we don't just breeze over it.
Okay, thank you. Stephen.
I would add to Hal's remarks, full support of the message. We could lead with that message from the superintendency or the to kind of help the messaging out there. But I'd also encourage a consideration for some type of asterisk to this year. It is a different year. I think there needs to be something on the report that says, yeah, see some additional information pertaining to that. Even if our participation rates are up, I think it does need to be an asterisk or something saying it was a unique year.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or discussions on this slide? Okay, so Scott, that gives us just over 15 minutes to address restarting accountability.
Yeah, so I get to be the bad guy, but it's going to come back, and this is in part we had a Anne Michelle, I think you were probably there. I know Sid was there as part of our groups that we run for Council of Chief State School Officers. SCAS is the obscure acronym. We bring in, and this is in each of the two groups that we run, there's about 40 state assessment leaders in one group and accountability directors in the other. And we do a joint session with the US Department of Ed every time we have a meeting. And we just did this, I don't even know what today is, but I think it was Tuesday, with US Ed and representatives from both the accountability folks and the assessment folks. And the group pressed them pretty hard on accountability in 2022 and the need for flexibility because of concerns about measuring growth, for instance, especially in states where participation rate was low. You know, we're seeing, we did a survey among these leaders and we saw, as Darren started, Utah is in the upper end of the distribution in terms of participation. There's, I would say the modal participation is in the like 80 to 90 range, which is not bad considering what people thought it would be, but it's, you know, back in the opt-out days, we were getting palpitations when it was down around 80. So, and then many are far below that. So the feds said pretty clear that they're unlikely to issue much accountability flexibility in 2022. They're going to want states to propose a system, and we pressed them pretty hard. Said stuff like, you know, taking growth out for again, these are states with lower participation rates. Taking growth out and replacing it with something else is a different system, or just, you know, not even replacing it, but just using a stat. It's a very different system. So they're going to want states to propose something. Many states will certainly resist, but a state like Utah would have a harder leg to stand on because you do have pretty good data in 21. And, you know, I don't think anybody wants to eliminate growth from Utah's accountability system. So we assume that it's going to be a prominent part and will continue to be a prominent part. And I do think, given what I know about participation now, we haven't dug in, that there's enough students tested in 21 to be able to calculate growth in 22. We always lose kids when we go from year to year. But I said here, we need to check subgroups by school. You know, it's one thing, the average is nice, but it's the variance that gets you. So we have to be looking at that. And so I'm just guessing because I know this group, you know, are there concerns with calculating and using growth in 2022? And what would convince you that it's okay, or at least if you didn't like it to begin with, what would convince you there's no worse than when you didn't like it? But so let me stop there and see if people have questions about this.
And Stephen, I see your hand up, but I think it's from before. If not, feel free to ask your question. So Scott, I'll share a concern that I have, and it's a preliminary concern. Again, there's still lots that we don't know. What we do know is that one of our school districts, San Juan, had about half of their schools that are under the direction of the Navajo Nation that never resumed to in-person learning, and didn't participate at a very high degree at all in the school accountability system. We know that that district has a significant number of students who are highly impacted, who that require additional supports for them to be able to reach academic proficiency. And I wonder, there's probably some other settings like that I'm not aware about across the state. So restarting accountability with growth. So whereas, and this goes to what you're saying, the variance is really what we have to pay attention to. Wondering how to handle the circumstances where in the variance we find exceptions that applying growth calculations to them in the context of school accountability would be unfair. I don't know how to deal with that.
I mean, it does remind me back to the opt-out days, right? We didn't cancel the state system. We figured out ways to deal with schools with as high percentages of opt-outs, and I have to be careful. It's going to sound worse than what I mean it, but we can't design for exceptions unless exceptions become so prominent that they overwhelm us. And so, if it's one school, we could do a workaround. If it's the entire indigenous population of the state, then that's a problem, right? Or if it's so disproportionately affecting poor rural areas, then that becomes a problem with the whole system. So looks like Rich has his hand up there.
I should take it down though, Scott. I think you captured how I would articulate that. I would suggest that we do calculate growth for 2022, and then if there are those instances and we see something that's on a larger scale, that we address it accordingly. But at surface value, at the end size that we have as a state, I think it would be very, very beneficial. And to that end, if there are areas of concern, that we address those specifically at that time.
Thanks, Rich. Are there others who's worried? Not going to make you feel less worried, probably, but I'll try.
Board Member Earl?
I'm not necessarily worried. I know that there's concerns there. I guess I'm thinking of those that have been allowed this year to use other methods for demonstrating their assessment or their progress. And I think if we run into some schools, and it sounds like there might just be a handful of those, that they may provide other evidence. And it just seems like that's reasonable. We've done that with turnaround. I don't know how, it just seems like it's a reasonable move to allow them the same possibility if their data from this year just really isn't workable because of opt-out or lack of participation. I think there's other ways that we can measure that. It may not be measured on growth because we don't have the data, but I think there are other ways to do it.
And the U.S. Department is going to likely require some type of duct tape fixes for cases, especially for schools that have been identified for comprehensive or targeted support. They're going to want you to find some way to attend to them. Let's go to the next slide, because the one thing, and I didn't even put it on the slide, if we look at the positive, right? So people are going to be putting a lot of effort into trying to help kids catch up or make up you know, for the disruptions. I don't like to say learning loss because I don't really believe it. And so, but people are going to be doing a lot, whether it's intensive tutoring, whether it's adding some time for kids or whatever it might be. And the value, one of the real values of growth, again, not necessarily at a kid level, but at a program level, is that it's a better mechanism for evaluation than achievement, because achievement is so highly correlated with things like wealth and background. And so growth provides a nice evaluative framework, and especially because of the way that student growth percentiles are calculated, it's normed, if you will, on the cohort that takes it in that year. So the state average, if you will, for 21 is going to be 50. The state average in 22 is going to be 50. But what we do see, we see differential growth. That doesn't mean the district average is going to be 50, or that doesn't mean the economically disadvantaged kids is going to be 50. And so where you're able to see this differential growth by subgroup, by district, by region, et cetera, however you want to break it out. And so the growth is a useful evaluative, not causal attribution, but to help us understand what might be working. But there's some straight facts here, right? Student growth percentiles are less stable or consistent with only one prior year. So this would be 21 because we have no 20 instead of 2 or more. We might be able to reach back to 19 for older kids, but that would be for very few kids in the system. Now it looks like achievement from the slides that Leslie showed you was slightly depressed, and people might think, oh, does that mean we're going to get this artificial bump? You know, it's like the rebound effect. But this notion of centering on 50 every year sort of will help with that. And there's a whole slew of analyses that are conducted any year, any normal year, for growth calculations. Things like how well does the model fit? Are there these weird cases that show up, particularly at the ends of the achievement continuum? And there are additional analyses beyond the normal, what we call goodness of fit studies, to look for red flags about using SGP results in accountability. We'll be able to do those before it's time to actually use it in accountability. So this seems to be the big issue. You might have other issues around multi-year averaging for certain indicators in smaller schools or things like that, to the extent that that's done, or trends, for exiting schools who are in targeted support, but or comprehensive. But this is the big issue in terms of accountability. So we just wanted to flag that for you guys.
Thank you, Scott, for putting this together and to leading the discussion. Is there anyone have other comments around the calculating growth? Sounds like this group supports moving forward with calculating growth percentiles using the 21 as a baseline to get the first year of growth calculations. Board Member Earl?
The only other concern I have is around the causation of discrepancies. I'm concerned about the political climate and miscalculating what's causing certain groups to not participate or to participate. That's my only caution, is to make sure that we're being honest with ourselves and honest with individuals, but we're not allowing it to control the political climate. So, and I'm talking about the opting, whether people are opting out or not there. We really need to find out the real reasons why and not just speculate on what those causations are. And I think local districts can be the best voice for finding that out and then addressing those needs locally. So.
Okay, thank you. Rich.
Hey, just a quick question. As we're thinking about restarting accountability and knowing that we have a legislative session between now and then, right, in January, are Are you hearing anything that, well, you may be able to share? Are there any legislators that are rethinking our accountability system during the interim? And any indication that our accountability system might be changed in the next session?
Your question, your question's perfect. The part of this meeting that would come next that I was going to cut out because of time. I'll respond to your question though, and then we'll revisit this in our next meeting when we meet in the fall. But the Utah State Board of Education and the Utah Legislature, representatives from the House and the Senate leadership are going to be engaging in work around potentially redesigning our school accountability system. There's a RFP that the State Board of Education is engaged with. I'm hopeful that it will be released this next week to find a consultant to help with that work, or maybe consultants who have expertise in that area. It will involve an executive committee that's made up of leadership.
Hey, Darren, Leslie and I are gonna, just for no comfort,
okay.
we're gonna get off, as we should be on when you're talking about this.
All right.
stuff.
Is there anything before you leave? Is there anything else that you
No,
want
this is a great discussion. You guys were on today. It was really a great discussion about all these things we needed input on. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott and Leslie.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Hi,
And
everyone.
the reason that they're jumping off is they very well might submit a proposal to this RFP. Let me slide into the last slide.
And Darren, if they can wait, I noticed it was on the very end of the agenda anyway, but if you're short on time, we can revisit.
Well, we've got enough time to respond to your question, and then we'll revisit. This is work that will, as you look at this timeline, you see it's built out over multiple months. And the end product could result in recommendations. As you know, the state legislature maintains authority over school accountability. So this is similar to how the funding study that's been conducted by the board over the last couple of years, where it's a little bit awkward because the board oversees and directs this funding study that can take recommendations to the legislature, and then the legislature has the authority to decide whether to implement any of those or not. So accountability is similar in some ways because of where the authority lies in that. But this is actually really exciting to me, Rich, that the policymakers that have authority over this, including the state board who's instituted with implementing the school accountability system, have an interest in looking at our accountability system and trying to find ways to improve it. Again, with the overall goal being to align our accountability system better with some of these initiatives, and then also to I like the very last sentence, to try to stimulate local accountability initiatives. I think most people know that continuous school improvement, the role of where that happens is at the school level, the local level, and the state level has levers that they can exercise to try to encourage or move, reinforce, support school improvement. But this is going to be some exciting work. It doesn't come around very often to where you've got an opportunity where people have interest in addressing something that's complex and challenging. And we don't know what will come out of it, but some of you might very well likely be invited to participate in one of these committees. Most likely the advisory committee. Superintendent Dixon will be sending out, if she hasn't already, invitations for that. And we're still finalizing the executive committee, which is made up again of members of the House and the Senate and the State Board of Education. So yeah, Rich, that was a very timely question. Brought us right to full circle to the end of our agenda. And while I don't have complete answers for you, I think it is important to understand that this work will be going on, and there's interest in people, and part of this process will be seeking beyond the advisory and executive committee. There'll be in the RFP, it directs consultants to seek statewide large scale feedback from our constituents across the state through the process. And Michelle, we'll let you ask your question, and then we'll wrap things up. And if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment that after the legislature passes such changes, we will have to submit a redlined plan of our ESSA consolidated state plan and have that approved by the Department of Education before the new accountability system would be enacted. So we're likely looking at fall of 2023 for it to become an actionable change in the accountability system. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. That's a great point. That's not included on this timeline. In the RFP, it talks about, it extends this timeline out further because actually implementing it would be potentially even more than 2020, out there a couple of years to implement the full system. So thank you. Board Member Earl?
Just one quick comment. It makes me wonder how we're redoing this, but then we're also setting up a plan for 10 years of our current assessment, wondering if do you know what I mean? We're setting something up for 10 years and signing into a contract for 10 years that looks like maybe in 3 to 4 years, we may be doing something possibly very different and for accountability. I guess I wonder if there's anything built into that if we choose to transition to something else.
Yeah, great question. The contracts that the board sign all have an option that allows the board to terminate those contracts at will throughout the process. So if there's changes that result in no longer a need for for assessment, or if there's some other type of assessment, which again, that seems given the speed at which the U.S. Department of Education makes changes seems unlikely. The state board is safe in the context of being able to terminate a contract, in this case with Cambion and Pearson, if they need to. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for taking your Friday morning. I really appreciate, on behalf of the board, I want to thank each of you for your participation to the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. The work that you do, the recommendations you provide are very valuable in the work that the board does around assessment accountability. So thank you and have a wonderful day. Yes, and congratulations, Rich, who's the superintendent of Granite School District now. Have a wonderful afternoon.